to address the nation momentarily. It's believed he will address the nation about Syria. As you know, the president has said a military strike could be coming. He has said that earlier in the week and continued to meet with his top national security advisors throughout the week. I do want to bring in our senior White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega. She's at the White House tonight monitoring developments. We do know, Cecilia, the president will be addressing the nation from the diplomatic room. What else do we know at this point?
Well, David, we don't know a lot. We know there is a lot of activity here at the White House right now, and we're told that the vice president, who is traveling abroad, and the pool reporters traveling with him were unexpectedly rushed back to their hotel. So definitely some activity happening here. This is all coming, of course, as the president has been roundly criticized for doing exactly what he said he would never do, which is broadcasting his plans for an attack in Syria. Of course, that tweet this week where he said, be ready, Russia, nice new smart missiles will be coming. Be interesting to see what he says here this evening. And David, how much Russia plays into this.
All right, Cecilia, stay with us here as we prepare to hear from the president. We know Secretary Mattis is over at the Pentagon. The president addressing the nation from the diplomatic room.
My fellow Americans, a short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. A combined operation with the armed forces of France and the United Kingdom is now underway. We thank them both. Tonight, I want to speak with you about why we have taken this action. 1 year ago, Assad launched a savage chemical weapons attack against his own innocent people. The United States responded with 58 missile strikes that destroyed 20% of the Syrian Air Force. Last Saturday, the Assad regime again deployed chemical weapons to slaughter innocent civilians, this time in the town of Douma, near the Syrian capital of Damascus. This massacre was a significant escalation in a pattern of chemical weapons use by that very terrible regime. The evil and the despicable attack left mothers and fathers, infants and children thrashing in pain and gasping for air. These are not the actions of a man. They are crimes of a monster instead. Following the horrors of World War I a century ago, civilized nations joined together to ban chemical warfare. Chemical weapons are uniquely dangerous, not only because they inflict gruesome suffering, but because even small amounts can unleash widespread devastation. The purpose of our actions tonight is to establish a strong deterrent against the production, spread, and use of chemical weapons. Establishing this deterrent is a vital national security interest of the United States. The combined American, British, and French response to these atrocities will integrate all instruments of our national power, military, economic, and diplomatic. We are prepared to sustain this response until the Syrian regime stops its use of prohibited chemical agents. I also have a message tonight for the two governments most responsible for supporting, equipping, and financing the criminal Assad regime. To Iran and to Russia, I ask, what kind of a nation wants to be associated with the mass murder of innocent men, women, and children? The nations of the world can be judged by the friends they keep. No nation can succeed in the long run by promoting rogue states, brutal tyrants, and murderous dictators. In 2013, President Putin and his government promised the world that they would guarantee the elimination of Syria's chemical weapons. Assad's recent attack and today's response are the direct result of Russia's failure to keep that promise. Russia must decide if it will continue down this dark path or if it will join with civilized nations as a force for stability and peace. Hopefully, someday we'll get along with Russia and maybe even Iran, but maybe not. I will say this: the United States has a lot to offer. With the greatest and most powerful economy in the history of the world. In Syria, the United States, with but a small force being used to eliminate what is left of ISIS, is doing what is necessary to protect the American people. Over the last year, nearly 100% of the territory once controlled by the so-called ISIS Caliphate in Syria and Iraq has been liberated and eliminated. The United States has also rebuilt our friendships across the Middle East. We have asked our partners to take greater responsibility for securing their home region, including contributing large amounts of money for the resources, equipment, and all of the anti-ISIS effort. Increased engagement from our friends, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Egypt, and others, can ensure that Iran does not profit from the eradication of ISIS. America does not seek an indefinite presence in Syria under no circumstances. As other nations step up their contributions, we look forward to the day when we can bring our warriors home, and great warriors they are. Looking around our very troubled world, Americans have no illusions. We cannot purge the world of evil or act everywhere there is tyranny. No amount of American blood or treasure can produce lasting peace and security in the Middle East. It's a troubled place. We will try to make it better, but it is a troubled place. The United States will be a partner and a friend, but the fate of the region lies in the hands of its own people. In the last century, we looked straight into the darkest places of the human soul. We saw the anguish that can be unleashed and the evil that can take hold. By the end of World War I, more than 1 million people had been killed or injured by chemical weapons. We never want to see that ghastly specter return. So today, the nations of Britain, France, and the United States of America have marshaled their righteous power against barbarism and brutality. Tonight, I ask all Americans to say a prayer for our noble warriors and our allies as they carry out their missions. We pray that God will bring comfort to those suffering in Syria. We pray that God will guide the whole region toward a future of dignity and of peace. And we pray that God will continue to watch over and bless the United States of America. Thank you and good night. Thank you.
President Trump addressing the nation tonight, revealing to the nation we have now launched precision strikes on Syria aimed at their chemical weapons. He revealed this is a combined operation of both the U.S., the U.K., and France. He'd been communicating with leaders of both countries throughout the week. He talked about President Assad in Syria, saying these are the crimes of a monster, describing the mothers, the children, the parents we saw in those images gasping for air. I want to bring in our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, who's been monitoring this all week, and now the president's speech tonight. Martha, what kind of strike is underway at this hour? And he's revealed that he's working with allies both from the UK and from France tonight.
And he certainly is, and there are warplanes in the area and warships as well. The words he used were they would go after chemical weapons capabilities. And I think that could be anything from airfields to aircraft. They believe these chemical weapons were delivered from barrel bombs from helicopters, so they will certainly go after something like that. But one of the things we've all been watching, David, this week is how strong an impact it will have. Last year, they did bomb that airfield, and within days, it was working once again. There were airplanes launched. So what they went after tonight, we don't know yet. The Pentagon will have a press briefing in about 45 minutes and fill us in on exactly what was hit and how strong an impact they think it will have. One of the things that Secretary Mattis said just yesterday, gives you some idea of what their concerns were, is he said, we are concerned that we don't add any civilian deaths. We're trying to stop the murder of innocent people, but on a strategic level, it's how do we keep this from escalating out of control? And that has been a real concern of Secretary Mattis. He does not want this to escalate. He does not want it to go beyond the borders.
And Martha, as you point out, chemical weapons capabilities. So let's bring in Steve Ganyard tonight, who's also watching this unfold with us, retired Colonel. Ganyard, what kind of strike do you think is taking place? And will this be a precision strike in one specific location? Or do you gather, given that he talked about chemical weapons capabilities, that this could be multiple sites we're looking at tonight?
David, this was a coordinated cruise missile attack from the sea and the air by U.S., French, and British forces against numerous targets within Syria.
Numerous targets. How many do you believe, and what kinds of targets?
Well, we'll wait on details from the Pentagon, David, but as Martha noted, right at the top of the list will be chemical weapons storage facilities. But we also know that the president asked for a broader set of targets this time. He wants to deal a crippling blow to the Assad regime. So we may see infrastructure, but we'll also see military command and control, intelligence headquarters. And David, if you look out there to the east of Damascus at Dumair Air Base, that is where intelligence estimates are that the attack on Duma was launched from. And so that airfield likely will also be on the list of targets tonight.
But Colonel Ganyard, you heard the president talk about the U.S. strike just about a year ago. Martha pointed out that the airstrip was being used literally within days of that strike. Do you gather that the strike this time around, or series of strikes, will be far more potent?
I think it will have to be, David. The president said he needs to make a statement, and the statement we made last time was nothing more than a warning. I think this time what's interesting, if you note these rings on the map here, these are rings that represent the maximum effective range of two very sophisticated Russian surface-to-air missile systems that military planners are having to try to avoid. They don't know if the Russians are going to try and shoot down the Allied cruise missiles in flight. And so the military planners have had to fly those missiles low through the mountains of Lebanon to get to their targets in Damascus, literally flying under the radar.
Yeah, we simply do not know at this hour if the Russians will take any countermeasures, though they had threatened to do so earlier in the week. I want to bring in our senior foreign correspondent, Ian Pannell. He's with us tonight from London. And Ian, you heard President Trump there single out both Russia and Iran, but in particular Vladimir Putin. He talked about how it was Russia's responsibility to guarantee that those chemical weapons would not be used any longer in Syria. And yet we witnessed this attack in just the last week.
Yeah, and let's not forget, of course, when President Obama drew his red line, it was Russia that acted as a guarantor for the decommissioning of chemical weapons by Syria, and the accusation tonight is that it didn't hold true to its word. However, there did seem to be something of an olive branch to Iran and also to Russia. It wasn't quite as hardline as some of the tweets that we saw earlier. Talking of tweets, we're certainly seeing early signs of people reporting sounds of explosions around different parts of Damascus and other parts of the country. This evening, none of that is verified at the moment, but as Colonel Ganyard suggested, this is going to be a bigger attack, a bigger strike than we saw 1 year ago. I mean, it has to be if they're going to try and achieve their objective.
likely a larger attack than a year ago. Ian, panel, our thanks to you. I want to bring in Cecilia Vega because, Cecilia, as you know, you've been at the White House all week. It was earlier this week President Trump sent out that tweet saying missiles were coming, to be ready, that they'd be nice, new, smart. He was criticized for telegraphing to the world what was coming when he said so often during the campaign that he would never do that. There seemed to be a bit of a slowdown as the week progressed, as he began talking with Secretary Mattis and other members of his top security team there in the White House.
Yeah, and he was so roundly criticized, David, for doing exactly what he said he would never do, which is broadcasting his military plans. And as you said, exactly sort of seemed to dial that back. Early on in the week, the president said a decision would be 24 to 48 hours. We are now days from that. Finally, this decision made. A number of people watching to see whether he would take a hard line with Putin, as he did over Twitter again this week, naming him for the first time by name, calling him out in his relationship with Syria's Bashar al-Assad. But I've got to tell you, David, all of this, of course, has been front and center for this White House, but it comes very much with so many distractions what they are dealing with right now. This major fight brewing between the president and his former FBI director, James Comey. It has been hard, I think, for them to concentrate and focus on Syria with all of that going on in the background.
And yet those strikes have been launched tonight as the president balances all of this. Cecilia, our thanks to you as well. Again, President Trump addressing the nation just a short time ago, revealing to the country that we have launched precision strikes against Syria aimed at decimating their chemical weapons capabilities. It's believed that these strikes will be much stronger than the strikes just about a year ago. We will wait to see what unfolds tonight. No reaction from Russia as of yet, but the president did reveal this is the work of not only the U.S. military, but the U.K. and France, two of our strongest allies, at work tonight in the skies over Syria. I'm David Muir reporting from the region here in Beirut. We will have continuing developments online. And for those of you watching in the West tonight, a special edition of World News Tonight coming up shortly. For the rest of you, enjoy the rest of your evening. I'm David Muir. Good night.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Good evening. This is Byron Pitts in New York. We're continuing our live coverage of the strike in Syria. President Trump announced at the top of the hour that the strike was underway in Syria, being supported by our allies in Great Britain and France. Joining us now for more detail is Stephanie Ramos at the Pentagon. Stephanie, what can you tell us? I know the strike is underway as we speak, and the Pentagon will have a press conference in the next half hour or so.
That's right, Byron. We are expecting to hear from Pentagon officials this evening to hear exactly what's taking place overseas right now. We have not gotten the precise details just yet on how this strike was carried out, but we do know that the military was poised and ready to carry out whatever order from the president. Now, we heard from President Trump, who explained why he ordered the U.S. military to strike Syria. As you mentioned, a combined effort with France and the U.K. to attack Syria's chemical weapons capabilities. He explained why he launched, because of last year's chemical attack in Syria and the one that we saw over the weekend. Now, President Trump also mentioned he will sustain this response until Assad's regime stops using chemical weapons. Also had a message for the Assad regime and to Russia, saying the strikes tonight are to establish a strong deterrent of chemical weapons. Now, I will let you know that we already knew there were destroyers in the region, in the eastern Mediterranean, able to deliver Tomahawk cruise missiles to targets in Syria. Now the question is, how strong of an impact will tonight's airstrikes have? Byron?
Stephanie Ramos at the Pentagon, thank you so much. We're now joined by Cecilia Vega, our senior White House correspondent outside the White House. Cecilia, the president had very strong words this evening.
He did on many levels, Byron. It's good to speak with you this evening. I think particularly from Capitol Hill, people will be looking to hear what the president had to say about Russia, particularly Vladimir Putin, because this week he called out for the first time Putin by name in tweets as Putin in his dealings with Bashar al-Assad of Syria. But, I've got to say the tone that the president used tonight on Russia struck me as much softer as the tone that he had earlier in the week, saying hopefully someday we'll get along with Russia, maybe Iran, maybe not. I'm also struck by the president saying that they are prepared to sustain this response until the Syrian regime stops its use of chemical weapons. We have no idea how long we are in this fight for at this point. There has been a lot of back and forth as to whether this would happen here today among the West Wing aides. You know that the president faced a lot of criticism in the weeks and the days leading up to this, I should say in the days leading up to this, with that tweet when he promised that there will be nice new smart missiles coming, and he warned Russia to get ready. And many of his critics especially said that he was doing exactly what he said he would never do, broadcasting military action to come. And then he sort of dialed that back in the days following and said that you wouldn't know whether we would strike. We may not strike at all. But here we are, of course, as we've all been covering tonight, those strikes that have indeed happened. And as we wait to find out what is happening on the ground there in Syria, Byron.
Cecilia Vega outside the White House. Cecilia, thank you so very much. Now we're going to Ian Pannell in London, ABC News senior foreign correspondent. Ian, what can you tell us?
Yeah, good evening, Byron. Well, look, we're just getting preliminary reports now. These are unverified reports. This is coming through social media, primarily from Twitter, but this is from residents in Damascus. Now, just to stress, we can't verify whether or not this is true or not, but these Twitter reports are saying there have been significant loud explosions, much louder than anything they've heard throughout the last few years of this war. There are suggestions about different places that have been targeted, so not just necessarily military airfields and obvious military sites, but perhaps those that are associated with the production or possible production of chemical facilities. But it is still very early days. We're expecting to hear from the Pentagon in the coming hour details of what it is that they're actually conducting, although one wouldn't expect that they're going to release a target list of those sites that they're going to aim at.
And any whispers yet from Russia what their response might be? I mean, as has been mentioned tonight, President Trump talked specifically about Russia's involvement as well as Iran. Any sense, any early reaction from that part of the world?
No, not hearing anything at the moment, and of course we're still waiting to hear from Paris and also from here in London, because of course the French and the British are also taking part. I mean, let's not forget that we know that the Russian military and the US military have been engaged in conversations over the last few years. They've been what they call deconflicting, in other words, making sure or trying to avoid any kind of catastrophic accident where Russian personnel are targeted or killed and that there is any kind of response there. So it's not like the Russians didn't know that this was coming. It's not like that they haven't been in a conversation. And I think we need to separate what we hear politically in terms of the noise and what actually goes on behind the scenes in terms of the business, and that these are two countries that, despite their differences, they are absolutely talking to one another, trying to deconflict, trying to work together. America is determined that this action was going to go ahead, and Russia has to live with that. The key here is that there aren't any unfortunate accidents.
Ian Pannell in London. Ian, thank you so very much. We go next now to Colonel Steve Ganyard, retired, the ABC News contributor in Washington. Colonel, good evening to you, sir. Walk us through what you think the plan is this evening.
Byron, I think what we're going to see here is the use of cruise missiles. And when we talk about cruise missiles, they're like little mini flying airplanes. They're not like ballistic missiles, the kind of threat that we see from North Korea. And the reason for that is that they will have been launched hundreds of miles away from Syria. The president, I think, has been very clear that he did not want to risk any U.S. military personnel or any allied personnel by getting them close to Syria where the Syrians could take a shot at them, or even get close to the Russians who have, in the past, had said that they would defend the Syrians. And so I think this is going to be lots of cruise missiles, could be hundreds of them, going to various targets around the country. And those targets could be a number of things. But I think the thing that's most interesting, and Ian talked about this before, was that the number of targets and the kinds of targets will have had to have changed from the attack last year. And that is they're going to have to be much more punishing because Mr. Assad obviously didn't get the message the first time around.
Colonel, talk some about the weapons likely used in this attack. As you just mentioned, the president was criticized in many circles for the attack last year and its limited impact, if it had any impact at all, on the Assad regime. What kinds of weapons do we think will be used this year? The president talked about in one of his tweets the smart weapons that the United States would use in this attack.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we remember all the way back in the Gulf War, those who remember seeing the pictures of the Tomahawk cruise missiles that would be launched from from ships. We're a whole generation beyond that. What's developed has been both the missiles that would have been shot by the Brits and by the French and by the U.S. tonight would have been what they call stealthy, meaning that they were very hard to see by radar, which means that with that fairly sophisticated surface-to-air missile system that the Russians have, as well as the Syrian air defense, it would allow these missiles to get in undetected to hit their targets in Syria. This is the first time for the U.S. this JASSM missile has been used in combat.
Colonel, thank you so very much. We now go to Peru, to Tara Palmieri, who's with Vice President Pence. Tara, I understand he was at an event and then he was called back to his hotel, sort of an indication that this attack was coming.
Right, Byron. It was an incredible experience. We were here at the Summit of the Americas. Vice President Pence is taking President Trump's place as a sign of respect to this area of the country, because President Trump said he needs some time to work on the Syria situation. But at the end of the day, Vice President Pence had to actually leave the event to go back to the hotel that I'm at right now. Behind me is the press pool and some of the Vice President Pence's aides, and we're actually watching the president delivering his speech on television right behind us. And it was an incredible experience. We were running from a major conference area to a motorcade, and the highway wasn't prepared for it, and we were just zooming through trying to get to this location so the vice president could be in place. We're not entirely sure, but it's likely that he needs to be near a secured line for this announcement.
Tara, thank you so much. Tara Palmieri reporting for us. I'm sorry, Tara, you had some more information you want to give us there? I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just saying that the vice president has been really involved in this entire process in terms of planning with Syria, so it's not entirely shocking that he'd be pulled out, but he may actually end up going back to this dinner tonight. But it was a wild experience.
All right. Tara Palmieri in Peru, thank you so much. Can we go back to Ian Pennell in London? Ian, I wanted to ask you a question. Oh, okay. So we're not going back to Ian. So we're going to go to the Pentagon next. We have a reporter there who will fill us in on what's going on there, anticipation of the press conference there. What can you tell us?
Well, Byron, we are expecting Defense Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to brief us here in about another half hour. Of course, because of operational security, this is an ongoing campaign. We won't learn many details. We're not expecting a ton of details, but obviously more than what we know right now. But they may talk about possible targets. We know that President Trump just mentioned attacking Syria's chemical weapons capabilities. That may include storage sites where some of these chemical weapons were being stored. Over this past week, we, of course, were discussing some of those options, taking into consideration that if they were to strike a chemicals weapons site, that could be dangerous for people, for civilians there in the area, for fear of that chemical dispersing. Another target could possibly be airfields. But then again, that was the target last year when President Trump ordered a similar airstrike, and 3 days later, Syrians were up and running on those same airfields. So it'll be interesting to see what General Dunford and Secretary Mattis have to say, but they are here in the building. They will be briefing us here shortly, and I will tell you, we had a sense that this was going to happen much earlier in the day. There were officials here that aren't typically here at this type of night here at the Pentagon. There were officials that had left in civilian clothes that were coming back later in the evening to put their uniforms back on and head into meetings. So there was a flurry of activity happening here earlier this evening that led us to believe that this was actually going to be carried out tonight. Of course, it's been a week. There's been speculation of a possible U.S. military action for the last couple of days. A lot of the options were discussed, and a lot of military options were presented to President Trump. He, of course, made his decision and ordered the U.S. military to carry out those strikes, and that's happening right now. Byron?
One follow-up question, if I may. One of the things that the president said that stuck out to me, he said he's prepared to sustain this response, an indication that this may go on well past this evening.
Absolutely. He did say that the strikes tonight are to establish a strong deterrent of chemical weapons. It seems as though President Trump is really trying to send a message this time around that he's not playing around. He doesn't want Assad's regime to continue to use these chemical weapons. He was, and we've said this before, it seems as though President Trump was really moved by those images in that video that was released after these chemical attacks over the weekend and last year. So because this may be a sustained campaign, again, President Trump may be trying to send that message that these actions can't continue. We heard from Secretary Mattis on Capitol Hill. He was there to talk about the DoD budget, but of course was asked about Syria, and he said this is not how this regime should be acting, and continue to say, of course, U.S. troops, nearly 2,000 U.S. troops are there in the region. Their safety is a big concern. They are there to defeat ISIS, but the U.S. can't just stand by and let Assad's regime continue to use chemical weapons. And this is why President Trump, with this combined effort with France and the U.K., carried out these airstrikes.
Stephanie Ramos at the Pentagon, thank you so much. So President Trump came out just after 9 o'clock this evening, East Coast time, to address the nation, saying that these strikes were underway involving the United States, Great Britain, and France. Here's some of what the president had to say when he addressed the nation just after 9 o'clock Eastern time tonight.
I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. A combined operation with the armed forces of France and the United Kingdom is now underway. We thank them both. Tonight, I want to speak with you about why we have taken this action. 1 year ago, Assad launched a savage chemical weapons attack against his own innocent people. The United States responded with 58 missile strikes that destroyed 20% of the Syrian Air Force. Last Saturday, the Assad regime again deployed chemical weapons to slaughter innocent civilians, this time in the town of Douma, near the Syrian capital of Damascus. This massacre was a significant escalation in a pattern of chemical weapons use by that very terrible regime. The evil and the despicable attack left mothers and fathers, infants and children thrashing in pain and gasping for air. These are not the actions of a man. They are crimes of a monster instead. Following the horrors of World War I a century ago, civilized nations joined together to ban chemical warfare. Chemical weapons are uniquely dangerous, not only because they inflict gruesome suffering, but because even small amounts can unleash widespread devastation.
President Trump speaking from the diplomatic room at the White House at 9 o'clock this evening Eastern Time. We're going now back to London, and our Ian Pannell, our ABC News senior foreign correspondent. Ian, could you give us some context about this? I mean, what's the sense around the world? Will this have any real impact on Assad's behavior?
I think that is absolutely a key question. It's easy to lose it amidst all the heat and light of the explosions and the military action. Let's not forget this is a limited military strike. It has a very specific purpose. This is not about unseating President Assad. It's not about regime change. It's not about ending the civil war or indeed even taking sides. What it is about trying to stop the use of chemical weapons. And don't forget, Britain, France and America are all absolutely convinced that there was some kind of chemical agent used in the strike on Douma, and we saw and we reported on Nightline, across ABC News, on digital, everywhere, those distressing images from Douma of those children, of men and women, some of whom were killed, others of whom were in a high state of distress, they're having difficulty breathing, etc., etc. There were signs that possibly some kind of chemical agent was used. The French say they're absolutely certain. The Americans have certainly gathered intelligence. They think there's a strong likelihood. The British also think that's the case. I have a statement here, actually, from the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, who spoke shortly after President Trump had finished addressing the nation, again reiterating the same thing, that this was a strike designed to target the chemical production facilities of the Syrian regime. But interestingly, she makes a point saying this is not about intervening in a civil war, it is not about regime change. So the question is, if you are one of those families living in Douma last week that was being bombed by conventional weapons, next week you are just as likely to be bombed by conventional weapons. This action, on paper at least, will not stop any of that, will degrade the ability of the Syrian regime, and it may give pause for thought, but this is not about anything larger.
Ian, thank you so much for the context. Stay with me. We're going to listen now to more comments from President Trump when he addressed the nation earlier this evening. Listen up.
Increased engagement from our friends, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Egypt, and others, can ensure that Iran does not profit from the eradication of ISIS. America does not seek an indefinite presence in Syria under no circumstances. As other nations step up their contributions, we look forward to the day when we can bring our warriors home, and great warriors they are.
Ian, how do you think those comments will play in the Middle East and the rest of the world? The president making the connection between the chemical attacks, what happened in Syria, and with this ongoing fight with ISIS in the country.
Yeah, remember, Byron, when the announcement was first made, or the first response was made to the alleged chemical attack, everyone said, well, hang around, President Trump a few days ago was saying that he wanted to pull US troops out. And they said, well, look, this is inconsistent. I think what we're seeing here is the restatement of a policy, a much bigger policy, that America does not want to get ensnarled in a long-term engagement in Syria. The reason that they engaged forces there was about the fight with ISIS, and that is largely coming to an end. It's not over, but it's getting in that direction. And this is something completely separate. In other words, the two things are kind of mutually exclusive. Now, you could see in a world where other forces get involved, it gets more complicated. But I think those words are absolutely designed to provide some comfort to US allies across the Middle East and to some critics who are saying, oh, this is just an American pretext, this is Iraq #2, this is about regime change. I mean, emphatically, the president is saying that's not about, that this is not what we're seeing tonight. This is about a limited action with a limited purpose, and that the long-term objective is for the withdrawal of US troops from Syria once the fight with ISIS is over with.
You know, get back to your earlier point in our conversation about the impact of tonight's strike. If Assad didn't get the message a year ago, a smaller effort by the United States, though this is bigger this time, according to the president, why should anyone believe that Assad will get the message this time?
Well, that is the question about the strikes that are taking place at the moment, and that's why we're just going to have to wait and see the scale of them. Now, it is still very, very early days, and out there on social media, we're starting to see a plethora of reports from people in and around Damascus suggesting this is much larger, much more significant. People who are residents there who are tweeting, again, this is unverified, we can't back this up at the moment, but are suggesting this is much bigger than anything that they've seen throughout the last few years of the civil war there. If that is the case, if the strikes are of that scale, not just about degrading facilities and damaging airfields, but targeting scientific production facilities, perhaps targeting some presidential facilities as well, it sends a message that America really has drawn a red line. But like I say, I don't think that will stop the war. There will still be other areas where Russian and regime planes will target rebel fighters, and that will inevitably lead to more civilian casualties.
Ian, thank you so very much from London. I want to go back to the Pentagon and Stephanie Ramos. Stephanie, I know that the Pentagon is preparing for a press briefing a little later, but have you been able to get any early intel as to what they might say in that press briefing?
Not just yet, Byron, but we do know it will be, we're expecting Defense Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and we actually just received a document used to brief congressional leaders, and it outlines why the president ordered the U.S. military to strike Syria. Gives a lot of detail here. It says here that the evidence of the Syrian regime's April 7th chemical attack is very clear. A large volume of high-resolution pictures and video from Douma clearly documents victims. Of course, we've seen seen those pictures from Duma showing those victims suffering from asphyxiation and foaming at the mouth with no visible signs of external wounds. It goes on to say that there were eyewitness accounts basically saying it's pretty clear that the Assad regime was responsible for that chemical attack, and this is why the president ordered those airstrikes. Again, the U.S. military was in place. We had destroyers there in the region. So did France. So did Britain. They were ready to go. U.S. officials here at the Pentagon were saying just that. They didn't know what was going to happen, but they were ready to carry out the president's order when that would happen, which happened tonight. But of course, we are waiting for more detail. We don't know precisely how those airstrikes were carried out, but we are expecting the defense secretary and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to speak with us here shortly.
Stephanie Ramos of the Pentagon, thank you so much. And Stephanie, if you get word, we will certainly come back to you. We'd like to go now back to Tara Palmieri in Peru, who's been traveling with the vice president. Any response there from the vice president or any member of his team?
Not yet. We haven't heard from them. And actually, the vice president is going to go back to the dinner that he left at the Summit of the Americas. You know, this is a really important dinner for our country to try to persuade these leaders that they should be doing trade with us over China. It was the president not attending this was a really big deal because it would be his first trip to South America. So having Vice President Pence there really mattered. So the fact that he basically had to jet out of this important summit of leaders from the North America and South America for this moment, it was really significant, and we weren't told anything about it. We weren't told where we were going. All we were told was run, get into the vans, and we just jetted here to this JW Marriott in Lima, Peru, where we believe that there was a secure line where the vice president was able to communicate with the president before the strike. And we've been here waiting, and you know, it's just been a really incredible night to not know exactly what was happening, but feeling the unexpected movement of knowing something big is coming and being with the vice president in this secure motorcade on our way back.
Star, it would seem then if the vice president does in fact go back to that dinner, I guess the impression that the U.S. is trying to leave is that it's now business as usual, things are under control, let's keep moving forward. You agree?
Right. I would agree with that. And it's also a sign to Latin American people at this summit that, you know, we do really care about these relationships. They're working on immigration, security, NAFTA, all really high-profile issues. Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, is with Vice President Pence, and they're trying to show that, you know, obviously a strike in the Middle East is a really big deal, but we still want a representative at the table, and so that is why, even though it takes a lot of energy to move the vice president from one place to another with security, that he was heading back and to ensure that our allies in the hemisphere are going to have a lot of questions about what this means, and does this mean that we're engaging in a broader regional war, you know, with Syria, Iran, Russia, and so, you know, the president, I'm sure, will be asked a lot of questions when he returns.
Tara Palmieri with the Vice President in Peru. Tara, thank you so very much. During the president's remarks this evening from the White House, he talked a lot about, he gave some time in sending a message directly to Russia. Let's listen to some of the president's comments now.
In 2013, President Putin and his government promised the world that they would guarantee the elimination of Syria's chemical weapons. Assad's recent attack and today's response are the direct result of Russia's failure to keep that promise. Russia must decide if it will continue down this dark path or if it will join with civilized nations as a force for stability and peace. Hopefully someday we'll get along with Russia and maybe even Iran, but maybe not.
We return now to the White House and Cecilia Vega. Cecilia, give us some context about this. I mean, for the longest time, President Trump was criticized for his bromance with the Russian leader. Now, strong words for Russia tonight.
And this really is what many, Byron, on Capitol Hill were looking to hear from the president. But, you know, this follows, there's been a ramp up in rhetoric on Russia and particularly Vladimir Putin by name this week from the president himself. You're so right. The criticism that this White House has faced time and time again is that there has been one public wording from aides, from people like Sarah Sanders, who may have used a tougher tone on Russia, from his former Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, then from President Trump himself. And then this week, in the face of this chemical attack that we saw in Syria, he called out Vladimir Putin by name on Twitter and said that Russia was responsible, Putin by name, Russia was responsible for backing the animal Assad. And he threatened Russia and said that Russia would pay a big price. And then, of course, came the other tweets where they threatened direct missiles, big, new, shiny, smart missiles would be heading straight for Russia in the face of this attack. And now we're hearing the president tonight say that Russia, calling out Russia, asking what country would want to be associated with the mass murder of men, women, and innocent children. So certainly we have been leading up to this. A lot of people on Capitol Hill, particularly the president's critics, have say this has been a long time coming. Byron.
So say, get your reaction to the president said, you reported it earlier, his one quote, prepare to sustain this response, an indication this could go well past this evening. Any response yet from Capitol Hill? I think many people thought that there would be some sort of military response, but I think the thought was that it would be brief, perhaps longer than a year ago, but certainly not a sustained response.
Well, some of the criticism that this president faced in the wake of the last response a year ago was that it was a pinprick. It really didn't do anything. And there have been calls from even Republicans in his own party saying that he had to do something stronger. John McCain called out the president for that tweet. Basically for the president a few weeks ago, saying that he wanted to pull all 2,000 American military members out of Syria. And John McCain said that the president emboldened Assad, blamed the president for that chemical attack, saying that President Trump had emboldened Assad to act with this threat of American withdrawal. So, the question about what happens next, what this means by sustained action, I don't think we know exactly. I would venture to guess that this is another threat to Assad, the Assad regime. If you act again, you will see more of this from the United States.
Cecilia Vega at the White House. Cecilia, thank you so very much. We're staying in Washington, going back to Colonel Steve Ganyard. Colonel, you may have heard our conversation earlier with Ian Pannell in London about sort of offering context about this. One of the criticisms about the attack a year ago was that it wasn't enough. It didn't change Assad's behavior at all. What's your sense about the potential impact of this strike?
Byron, Syria is a really messy place, and you've got Turkey, you have Russia, you have Iran, you have Israel, you have Saudi Arabia, all have interests there, and on top of that, you have ISIS. And ISIS has been our focus, not the Assad regime. But when Assad gasses his own people, that was a red line for this president. He did a pinprick strike last year to say, don't do that again. That Mr. Assad ignored that. The irony being, Byron, that this town of Douma had been attacked with chemicals 4 times since January. This was the 4th time. 20 people were killed in January. So this time 76 some odd people, but it finally got enough press play and the president felt he had to react. So in Syria, there are no good guys. And the president has also suggested that he's going to be pulling U.S. troops out over time. So what the president's doing here is reacting to a crime against humanity and trying to get Mr. Assad to stop gassing his people. But it really doesn't fit into any kind of long-term U.S. strategy in Syria now that ISIS is on the verge of defeat.
Colonel, please stay with me. We're going to go back to Stephanie Ramos at the Pentagon. We understand has some more detail. And then, Colonel, I want to get your response to this new information that Stephanie will share with us. Stephanie.
Hey there, Byron, where we are learning from this congressional brief, this document that was meant for congressional leaders, where it says that these strikes were targeting facilities at the heart of the Syrian chemical weapons program. These sites are directly linked with Syria's chemical weapons program, and it says here that it will help prevent the regime from conducting additional horrific chemical weapons attacks like the one that we saw. But we're also getting new details from the UK. The UK Ministry of Defense saying that the UK element of this operation carefully coordinated joint action with their Royal Air Force Tornado GR4s. That's the weapon that they launched, Storm Shadow missiles at a military facility, a former missile base about 15 miles west of Homs, where the regime is assessed to keep chemical weapon precursors stockpiled. So again, back to the chemical weapons storage sites. This seems to be one of those sites here that was targeted by the UK. Byron?
Stephanie, thank you so very much. We're going now to our Chief Global Affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz. Martha, what can you tell us?
Well, I think we're standing by for this Pentagon briefing. I know Stephanie just said that as well. I think you will see a broader target list. I think most definitely you will see a broader target list. You heard the president say they will go after chemical weapons capability. That can mean quite a bit. I think one of the difficult things would be to find a chemical weapons storage area. I know we've talked about that a lot, but frankly, the U.S. thought those chemical weapons had been removed, even though there was the attack last year. So if they've gone after a storage area, they had some hard looking to do during this week, but they would also go after airfields where possibly those helicopters took off from that were carrying the barrel bombs that delivered those chemical weapons into Douma on April 7th on last Saturday. So we've really come this far in 6 days. I know a year ago it was about 3 days. And I know they also had to slow President Trump down just a bit. You heard him on Wednesday saying, look out, these missiles are coming, and then later kind of walking that back. I don't know whether it will be soon or not very soon. They really wanted to take a hard look at these targets. I know there was some back and forth. Do we go even stronger? Do you go after infrastructure? Do you go after something bigger? And whatever this target list is, it seems somewhere in between that, a much bigger statement than last year, but not as big as some people in the administration probably wanted.
Martha, I had a conversation earlier this evening with Ian about offering context about this. Part of the criticism of what President Trump did last year was that it was too small and that Assad, it didn't change his behavior at all. What's the sense you're getting at this point that this is meant to be, this is the night that will change Assad's behavior, or that, as the president phrased it, a sustained response might be coming?
And I think by a sustained response, he did not mean it, because that caught my ear too, Byron. I do not think he meant we're going to see airstrikes over the next couple of days. I think by sustained, he meant if you used chemical weapons again, we'll be back. And that is essentially what the U.S. did this time, with France and Britain helping out. So I think we've got our eye on you. I think we all have looked at Syria over these many, many years in the civil war. Will it change that? Probably not. I mean, you have had hundreds of thousands of people die there in terrible, terrible ways. A chemical weapon is an awful, awful way to die. It's why it is a war crime. But the fighting will probably go on there. Maybe he'll be more careful with chemical weapons in the future, because maybe this strike will drive that point home, but it won't change the outcome of this war. And as you also heard President Trump say, he wants to get out of Syria. He wants to get out of there soon. The job against ISIS is pretty much complete, he thinks, although the military says there's more to do and the administration says they will finish the job. But this is not a place that President Trump wants to stay.
Martha, you've spent considerable time in that part of the world. What do you think that the likely response will be from Syria's neighbors, both its enemies and its allies?
I think probably very muted. I mean, I think you'll hear a lot of rhetoric, but I don't think you'll see much beyond that. Just a lot of rhetoric, just a lot of, finger pointing. The Russians, you've heard the Russians this week talk quite a bit, saying it was a fake chemical attack. I also think you'll see a lot about that and just what they found and just the kind of evidence they found. Interesting that you do have an international group of investigators on the ground or on their way to Duma to find even more evidence if they can.
Martha, this may not be a fair question to ask, but I'll ask it of you anyway. What are the politics, you think, of what's happening this evening? Because there's certainly a lot that's on the president's plate domestically. And certainly his critics have talked about that. What's your sense of that?
I think that's a tough question to ask, Byron. It's a tough question to answer. Certainly there is so much swirling around at the White House, and the president was seething, as we all know, and as our White House correspondents have told you, seething all week about the news, about Comey, about Mueller, about Cohen in particular, his attorney. This happened, however, 1 week ago. We saw those images. The president responds to images. That's what he responded to last time. So it is legitimate to say, I got to do something about that, because I said before I would do something about that if it happened again. So that is certainly a legitimate reason to do it.
Martha Raddatz, thank you so very much.
You bet.
Go back to President Trump's closing remarks when he addressed the nation just past 9 o'clock Eastern Time, saying that the strikes in Syria were underway.
By the end of World War I, more than 1 million people had been killed or injured by chemical weapons. We never want to see that ghastly specter return. So today, the nations of Britain, France, and the United States of America have marshaled their righteous power against barbarism and brutality. Tonight I ask all Americans to say a prayer for our noble warriors and our allies as they carry out their missions. We pray that God will bring comfort to those suffering in Syria. We pray that God will guide the whole region toward a future of dignity and of peace. And we pray that God will continue to watch over and bless the United States of America. Thank you and good night. Thank you.
Words tonight from President Trump at the diplomatic room at the White House just past 9 o'clock Eastern Time this evening, announcing to the nation that strikes were underway in Syria. Syria is about 7 hours ahead of us, so it will be morning there in the not-too-distant future. I'd like to go back to the White House, back to the Pentagon and Stephanie Ramos. Stephanie, I know that the Pentagon briefing is in a few minutes, but have you been able to glean any new information?
Not just yet, but again, that briefing is happening here, as you said, in just a few minutes with Defense Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We are expecting them, again, in just a few minutes to give us more details of what took place there in Syria. We've heard from Secretary Mattis a couple of times this week where he was at the White House for a few meetings with the president, presenting him with those military options, one of which we presume the president took and took action on tonight. But the last couple of days, we also saw a lot of canceled trips from U.S. officials, including Defense Secretary Mattis, who was supposed to be up in New York yesterday, canceled that trip, also canceled a trip over the weekend, signaling that something was going to take place, that the U.S. military was going to carry out this strike. But we also heard from him on the Hill. He said that although the U.S. strategy in Syria, and as I mentioned earlier, is to defeat ISIS and not engage in the civil war itself, some things like the use of chemical weapons are simply inexcusable, beyond the pale, and in the worst interest of civilization itself. So Mattis standing by, in a sense, standing by that airstrike from last year, and this order that came down from the president against Assad's regime for using those chemical weapons. So again, we'll hear from Secretary Mattis here in a few minutes, and General Dunford as well. Byron.
Stephanie, any sense to why tonight, as we've discussed this evening, when President Trump sent out these very strong tweets a few days ago suggesting that the response was coming soon, but it happened tonight. Any sense of why the Pentagon, why the president chose to to make this strike on Syria tonight with our allies in France and Great Britain?
Well, Byron, we understand that the U.S. military was moving their assets around. We have destroyers out in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. France and Britain, they were also moving some of their assets around. And we heard from UN Ambassador Nikki Haley this morning at the UN Security Council praising President Trump, saying she was unbelievably proud of him for his handling of this situation, saying that she was so proud that the president didn't rush into this and that he was taking his time in coming to a decision, and saying that the U.S. was taking every necessary precaution in this situation. She also came down here to D.C. from New York to meet with the president over at the White House. And again, she said she was very proud of the president for taking his time. Again, the Secretary Mattis and other U.S. officials and military officials were presenting the president with a number of different options. And this was a mission that needed to be carefully thought out because of what happened a year ago, 3 days after last year's airstrike. They were flying again at that same airfield. But right now, we're going to check in with that briefing starting right now with Secretary Mattis and General Dunford.
Stephanie, thanks so much. It looks like that briefing is about to start. We have our a camera there, as everyone can see. And as soon as the Secretary walks out, we will begin. But just to recap, just after 9 o'clock Eastern Time, President Trump came out in the White House to announce that strikes were underway in Syria, led by the United States in conjunction with our allies in France and Great Britain. The president had very strong words for the Assad regime, saying they are crimes of a monster, the evil and despicable attack, talking about those chemical attacks last weekend in Syria, in a suburb just outside Damascus. Now moving towards the podium, Secretary of Defense.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As the world knows, the Syrian people have suffered terribly under the prolonged brutality of the Assad regime. On April 7th, the regime decided to again defy the norms of civilized people, showing callous disregard for international law by using chemical weapons to murder women, children, and other innocents. We and our allies find these atrocities inexcusable. As our Commander-in-Chief, the President has the authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to use military force overseas to defend important United States national interests. The United States has vital national interest in averting a worsening catastrophe in Syria and specifically deterring the use and proliferation of chemical weapons. Last year, in response to a chemical weapons attack against civilians and to signal the regime to cease chemical weapons use, we targeted the military base from which the weapons were delivered. Earlier today, President Trump directed the U.S. military to conduct operations in consonance with our allies to destroy the Syrian regime's chemical weapons research, development, and production capabilities. Tonight, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States took decisive action to strike the Syrian chemical weapons infrastructure. Clearly, the Assad regime did not get the message last year. This time, our allies and we have struck harder. Together, we have sent a clear message to Assad and his murderous lieutenants that they should not perpetrate another chemical weapons attack for which they will be held accountable. The 70 nations in the Defeat ISIS coalition remain committed to defeating ISIS in Syria. The strike tonight separately demonstrates 70 nations in the Defeat ISIS coalition remain committed to defeating ISIS in Syria. The strike tonight separately demonstrates international resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used on anyone under any circumstance in contravention of international law. I want to emphasize that these strikes are directed at the Syrian regime. In conducting these strikes, we have gone to great lengths to avoid civilian and foreign casualties. But it is a time for all civilized nations to urgently unite in ending the Syrian civil war by supporting the United Nations-backed Geneva peace process. In accordance with the Chemical Weapons Convention prohibiting the use of such weapons, we urge responsible nations to condemn the Assad regime and to join us in our firm resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used again. General Dunford will provide a military update.
Hey, good evening. I'm joined by our French attaché, Brigadier General Montague, and our British attaché, Air Vice Marshal Gavin Parker. Secretary Mattis has just outlined the policy and legal framework for tonight's strike in Syria. I'll address the strike from the military dimension. At 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, French, British, and U.S. forces struck targets in Syria in support of President Trump's objective to deter the future use of chemical weapons. Our forces were integrated throughout the planning and execution of the operation. The targets that were struck and destroyed were specifically associated with the Syrian regime's chemical weapons program. We also selected targets that would minimize the risk to innocent civilians. The first target was a scientific research center located in the greater Damascus area. This military facility was a Syrian center for the research, development, production, and testing of chemical and biological warfare technology. The second target was a chemical weapons storage facility west of Homs. We assessed that this was the primary location of Syrian sarin and precursor production equipment. The third target, which was in the vicinity of the second target, contained both a chemical weapons equipment storage facility and an important command post. U.S., British, and French naval and air forces were involved in the operation, and for reasons of operational security, I won't be more specific this evening. Before we take questions, I'd like to address how this evening's strike were qualitatively and quantitatively different than 2017. Last year, we conducted a unilateral strike on a single site. The focus was on the aircraft associated with the Syrian chemical weapons attack in April of 2017. This evening, we conducted strikes with two allies on multiple sites that will result in a long-term degradation of Syria's capability to research, develop, and employ chemical and biological weapons. Important infrastructure was destroyed, which will result in a setback for the Syrian regime. They will lose years of research and development data, specialized equipment, and expensive chemical weapons precursors. The strike was not only a strong message to the regime that their actions were inexcusable, but it also inflicted maximum damage without unnecessary risk to innocent civilians. And with that, the Secretary and I would be glad to take your questions.
Mr. Secretary, first of all, did the U.S. suffer any losses initially? And more broadly, could you, the President in his remarks said that the U.S. and its allies are prepared to sustain this operation until Syria stops using chemical weapons. Does this mean that the U.S. and its partners will continue military operations beyond this initial operation tonight?
That will depend on Mr. Assad should he decide to use more chemical weapons in the future. And of course, the powers that have signed the chemical weapons prohibition have every reason to challenge Assad should he choose to violate that. But right now, this is a one-time shot, and I believe that it sent a very strong message to dissuade him, to deter him from doing this again.
Any U.S. losses?
We'll brief on that in the morning. We want to give you a full brief in the morning. Right now, we have no reports of losses.
Thank you.
Secretary Mattis, Chairman Dunford, thank you for doing that. Have you seen any retaliation from the Russians or the Iranians? And how long do you think this operation could last? Is it a matter of hours or days, or could go longer than that?
Yeah, we did have some initial surface-to-air missile activity from the Syrian regime. That's the only retaliatory action that we're aware of at this time. And the nature of the operation, we've completed the targets that were assigned to the United States Central Command. Those operations are complete.
General Dunford and also Secretary Mattis, could you talk a little bit more about your concerns that you've expressed earlier in the week about Russian escalation General Dunford, were you able to talk to your Russian counterpart, General Gerasimov? What are your concerns about escalation? And if we're permitted to ask your British counterpart a question, I would like to know the sense of your government about whether the situation with the Skripals and the Russian involvement in that, how that Russian involvement played a role in your decision to enter this coalition this evening.
Barbara, let me address the last point first. Our attachés were kind enough to join us this evening. They're not going to get out in front of their president and prime minister, respectively, so that the national messages will be provided from their capitals here very soon. But with regard to the Russian concerns, we specifically identified these targets to mitigate the risk of Russian forces being involved, and we used our normal deconfliction channels. Those were active this week to work through the airspace issues and so forth. We did not do any coordination with the Russians on the strikes, nor did we pre-notify them.
Mr. Secretary, it was just a couple of days ago that you said you're still assessing the intelligence on the chemical weapons attack, suspected attack. So at this point, do you know what the chemical was used in that attack? Was it sarin? Was it chlorine? And also, what is your evidence it was actually delivered by the Syrian regime?
Say the last part again, Tom.
What's your evidence it was delivered by the Syrian regime? Are you quite clear it was?
I am confident the Syrian regime conducted a chemical attack on innocent people in this last week. Yes, absolutely confident of it. And we have the intelligence level of confidence that we needed to conduct the attack.
As far as the actual chemical used, do you know what it was? Was it nerve agent? Was it chlorine? Do you have a sense of what it was?
We are very much aware of one of the agents. There may have been more than one agent used. We are not clear on that yet. We know at least one chemical agent was used.
I just want to clarify on the deconfliction line. You notified the Russians ahead of time before the operation began what you were going to do and what targets you were going to strike?
Gordon, to be clear, the only communications that took place specifically associated with this operation before the targets were struck was the normal deconfliction of the airspace, the procedures that are in place for all of our operations in Syria.
General Dunford, you mentioned that the Syrian air defenses had engaged. The Syrian state TV is saying they shot down 13 Tomahawk missiles. Can you refute that?
Jennifer, I can't tell you the results. We literally, as you know, the time on target was about an hour ago, and we came straight up here to give you the best information we have right now. Tomorrow morning, as the Secretary will talk about in a minute, we'll give you the more detailed operational update and some of the details, but those details aren't available to us right now.
This wave of airstrikes is over.
This wave of airstrikes is over. That's why we're out here speaking to you now.
Secretary Mattis, I just wanted to follow up on what you said about the legal basis for this strike. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because in your testimony the other day, it sounded like you were saying that this a potential strike would somehow be linked to self-defense and the presence of American forces in Syria. Can you say a little bit more about that? And also regarding whether or not there will be future action or additional strikes. You said that it would depend on whether or not the Assad government conducts future chemical attacks, but can you explain a little bit more about what would be the threshold for that? Because there were repeated chemical attacks between the April 2017 attack and today, and would you consider a small-scale chlorine attack sufficient to launch additional strikes?
Right now, I will just tell you we're in close consultation with our allies. We review all the evidence all the time. It is difficult, as you know, to get evidence out of Syria, but right now we have no additional attacks planned. But as far as the legal authority under the Article 2 of the Constitution, we believe the President has every reason to defend vital American interests, and that is what he did here tonight under that authority.
Hey, sir, a couple questions for General Dunford. What were some of the targeting considerations or difficulties involved with going after chemical facilities? How long did the operation take to plan? And for Secretary Mattis, last year's strikes were described as proportional, moderate. How would you describe this year's in contrast to that?
Yeah, Tony, we chose these particular targets to mitigate the risk of civilian casualties, number one. We chose these targets because they were specifically associated with the chemical program, the Syrian chemical program. And obviously, when we take a look at target planning and so forth, we look at the location relative to other populated areas, collateral damage, proportionality. So these targets were carefully selected with proportionality, discrimination, and being specifically associated with the chemical program.
All standoff weapons or any manned aircraft?
There were manned aircraft involved. I won't give you any of the details operational until tomorrow morning, but we will do that at that time.
Sir, instead of proportional last year,
a question to Secretary Mattis. So up until yesterday, and I'm going to quote you here, you said, "I cannot tell you that we have evidence." So when did you become confident that a chemical attack happened? And the second one...
Yeah, yesterday.
Yesterday, after you said that?
Yes.
And then second, you talked about targeting the chemical weapons infrastructure of al-Assad. If there were actually any chemical weapons or agents in those facilities that you targeted, I assume they would create health hazard in the region or not?
Yeah, we don't believe. We did very close analysis. As the chairman pointed out, we did everything we could in our intelligence assessment and our planning to minimize to the maximum degree possible any chance of civilian casualties. We are very much aware this is difficult to do in a situation like this, especially when the poison gas that Assad assured the world he had gotten rid of obviously still exists. So it is a challenging problem set, and we had the right military officers dealing with it.
So you can confirm there's going to be no leak into the air? Or
of course not. We'll do our best.
When the surface-to-air defenses engaged, did they become a target, and did U.S. air power or other assets take out those targets?
Yeah, Tora, I'm not aware of any response that we took right now. Again, we'll gather overnight. As you can imagine, we tried to leave the United States Central Command alone here tonight. They were quite busy. We'll, through the night, gather the operational detail, and we'll be back tomorrow morning to provide that to you.
Yeah, Secretary Mattis or Chairman Dunford, last year, you changed the force protection levels for the Syrian troops that were U.S. troops that were in Syria. There are 2,000 U.S. troops in Syria. Have you changed force protection levels based on potential responses from Russia?
Yeah, Hans, as you can imagine, the commander always takes prudent measures, especially in an environment that they were in tonight. So they did make adjustments.
And just to be clear on the deconfliction line, you told them that you're going to be operating in airspace, but you didn't tell them, the Russians, what the targets were?
That is absolutely correct. We used the normal deconfliction channels to deconflict the airspace that we were using. We did not coordinate targets or any planning with the Russians.
What was their response, sir?
That information was passed at the operational link from the Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar, so I wasn't on the line. But that kind of information, just to put it in perspective, is passed routinely every day and every night. So they may not have found anything unusual about that particular airspace deconfliction.
Thank you so much, Katrina Manson from the Financial Times. Can you talk a little bit about any Iran targets that you initially, Iran-associated targets that you initially considered, and why you may have not gone for them? And could your colleagues explain exactly the sort of contribution that you've made to tonight's operation?
Yeah, again, our allied officers are here out of respect for the fact that they were part of the mission from planning all the way through to the political decision taken. And once their heads of state speak tomorrow, then that'll be the initial statement from those capitals. But as far as any other targets, we looked at targets specifically designed to address the chemical weapons threat that we have seen manifested. The whole world has watched in horror these weapons being used. Those were the only targets that we were examining for prosecution.
Mr. Secretary and General Dunford, you mentioned 3 target areas that were struck. How can you be sure that from now on these are all of the target areas or all of the involved production facilities for chemical weapons that the Syrians are using? And do you believe that there are additional locations where they are producing such materials?
This is a great question. We had a number of targets to select from, and again, we did not select those that had a high risk of collateral damage and specifically a high risk of civilian casualties. And so the weaponeering, back to the earlier question, the weaponeering was done, the modeling was done to make sure that we mitigated the risk of any chemicals that were in those facilities and mitigate the risk of civilian casualties. So were there other targets that we looked at? There were. We selected these specific targets both based on the significance to the chemical weapons program as well as the location and the layout.
Thanks. Secretary Mattis, it seems like this strike tonight was pretty limited, not too dissimilar from last year. I know it was three targets this time instead of one, but it still seems a little bit more targeted and more specific than what I think a lot of people were expecting. Can you walk us through your decision to, did concern about escalation with Russia affect your decision to keep this more targeted? And moving from there, how much assurance can you give us that this is going to do what the strike last year didn't do, which is basically to stop President Assad from using chemical weapons again?
Nothing is certain in these kinds of matters. However, we used a little over double the number of weapons this year than we used last year. It was done on targets that we believed were selective to hurt the chemical weapons program. We confined it to the chemical weapons type targets. We were not out to expand this. We were very precise and proportionate, but at the same time, it was a heavy strike.
Mr. Secretary, prior to the attack, how important was it to get the support from the allies, not only from an intelligence point of view, but also just from the countries themselves?
It's always important that we act internationally in a unified way over something, especially that is such an atrocity as this, that we've observed going on in Syria. But I would also tell you that these allies, the Americans, the French, the British, we have operated together through thick and thin, through good times and bad. And this is a very, very well integrated team. Wherever we operate, we do so with complete trust in each other, the professionalism, but more than that, the belief that one another will be there when the chips are down. So it's important, and it's a statement about the level of trust between our nations.
General Dunford, could you just let us know whether the Syrians were able to hide a lot of these chemical weapons in the last several days, since there's been so much talk about a possible strike? Did that give the Syrians time to kind of move some of these weapons off limits? And then Secretary Mattis, just to confirm earlier when you were saying you had information about one of the chemicals, but we're all assuming that means chlorine, that you had information confirming chlorine, but not necessarily sarin. If you could just clarify that part.
Yeah, Phil, the first question, I'm not aware of any specific actions that the Syrians took to move chemical weapons in the last couple of days.
Yeah, we're very confident that chlorine was used. We are not ruling out sarin right now. Yeah.
General, I'd like to follow up on Lewis's question about the targets that you first examined and then triaged down to the 3 tonight. It sounds like you went after facilities and not the actual weapons, as indicated earlier, to minimize accidental risk to civilians. In the targets that remain, could you characterize perhaps the ability for Syria to ramp up again and again have chemical weapons?
Yeah, I think it's too early to make that assessment. It's too early to make that assessment right now.
Last question, General.
Thank you. General Dunford, did any Russian defenses engage U.S., British, or French ships or missiles? And Secretary Mattis, were any of the strikes tonight intended to kill Bashar al-Assad?
The only reaction that I'm aware of at this time was Syrian surface-to-air missiles. I happen to be down in the National Military Command Center and was aware of that activity. I'm not aware of any Russian activity, and I'm not aware of the full scope of the Syrian regime response at this time. Again, those will be details we'll pull together for you in the morning.
Yeah, the targets tonight, again, were specifically designed to degrade the Syrian war machine's ability to create chemical weapons and to set that back right now. There were no attempts to broaden or expand that target set. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming in this evening. Based on recent experience, we fully expect a significant disinformation campaign over the coming days by those who have aligned themselves with the Assad regime. And in an effort to maintain transparency and accuracy, my Assistant for Public Affairs, Ms. Dana White, and Lieutenant General McKenzie, the Director of the Joint Staff here in Washington, will provide a brief of known details tomorrow morning. We anticipate about 9 o'clock in this same location. But thank you again for coming in this evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
You were just listening to Defense Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in the Pentagon briefing room, going over the details about this airstrike that took place in Syria, ordered by President Trump. Defense Secretary Mattis not wasting any time, speaking first about the Syrian people, saying they have suffered because of the use of chemical weapons. We've seen those heartbreaking images of children and adults suffering from those chemical weapons attacks in Syria. Secretary Mattis saying that is inexcusable, and that's why the United States reacted the way it did in combination with France and the UK. Now, General Dunford did go over the areas targeted by the U.S., by France and the UK. He says they tried their best to not target civilians and foreign people there in that area. One place that was targeted, a scientific research center. The goal there to destroy the Syrian regime's chemical weapons research development facilities, also targeted a chemical weapons storage facility and an important command post. Of course, we will learn more details in the morning. As Secretary Mattis mentioned, there will be a briefing tomorrow morning. We will have more for you on Good Morning America tomorrow, Saturday. And of course, for more information, you can stay with us on abcnews.com. I'm Stephanie Ramos, live from the Pentagon here in Arlington. Have a good night.
Aircraft involved, probably to protect against the surface-to-air missiles that the Syrians may have launched. No assessment of the effectiveness of the strike yet. No assessment of any losses yet. I thought it was very important that they had with them the liaison officers from the French Air Force and also from the British. It was clear that they did not go after the weapons. They went after the facilities to develop those weapons and the facilities to store them, and probably some of the capability to put them on the aircraft, but they stayed away from the weapons out of concerns for collateral damage.
General, let me ask you about that, because there were no airfields that were targeted, unlike the strike a year ago, but these storage facilities. Does that strike you as on purpose?
I think so. Normally with chemical weapons, they are not mated together to be active until you load them. And so the storage sites would have the precursors in one area and in this case, chlorine gas or nerve agents or whatever it is in a separate area. So they could go after those with good precision targeting. Once they get to the aircraft or the airfield, they're probably mated together, and there's where you get the opportunity to redisperse them if you go after the weapon itself.
We're speaking to retired Marine General James Cartwright, the former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I want to ask you about one other thing that I believe General Dunford said, and that is that Syria shot surface-to-air missiles in response, but that was the only retaliatory action seen so far. Likely that retaliation made little difference.
It's hard to say. I think there was one report that they're claiming they shot down 13 Tomahawks. This is probably part of what the Secretary was speaking to right at the very end of the conference, the press conference, that there'd be this information campaign. So it's going to be difficult to assess that. But my sense is here that the strike went very much as planned. Understand that the deconfliction protocols are basically creating blocks of time and blocks of airspace for each day. So those areas would have been basically known to be flown in, and therefore the Russians would not be in there. unlikely the Iranians would be in there. So they had the best opportunity to go without telegraphing the punch, so to speak. It's probably also an area where the Russian SAMs, or the surface-to-air missiles, don't go, and they're normally controlled by American defensive systems.
General, we appreciate your insights. Retired Marine General James Cartwright, the former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with us on a night when President Trump announced U.S. military action with the French and the British forces targeting chemical weapons storage facilities, mainly in Syria. There have been a number of eyewitness reports of explosions lighting up the night sky in Damascus. Some reports that the Syrians were able to shoot off some surface-to-air missiles to take down some of what the U.S. and its allies fired their way, and a statement from President Assad that comes via Twitter. The Syrian presidency tweets, "Good souls will never be humiliated after the airstrikes." A targeted strike to deter, as President Trump said tonight, Bashar al-Assad from using chemical weapons again. I'm Aaron Katursky. You're listening to live coverage from ABC News. We return to ABC's Karen Travers, our White House correspondent. The president tonight was clear that the U.S. would sustain this campaign in order to fully stop Bashar al-Assad from using chemical weapons. But for the moment, as we heard from Defense Secretary Mattis a moment ago, one-time shot.
Yeah, that was a bit of a clarification there that came in response to a question about what did the president mean about sustaining this response until the Syrian regime stops its use of chemical weapons. And Defense Secretary Mattis said that this target tonight was designed to degrade the Syrian regime's capabilities on chemical weapons and to send a very strong message to dissuade Assad from doing this again. One-time shot is the phrase that he used, and he said that this is this wave of airstrikes is over as far as they've announced. But I think it is notable, the question then of what happens next. The president saying until the Syrian regime stops its use of chemical weapons. Well, they made this statement last April. The president said that was in the vital national security interest of the United States, responding to that sarin gas attack. The president used the exact same phrase tonight, saying that this strike tonight in Syria was in the vital national security interest of the United States. And there was certainly a lot of talk this week that this response was going to have to be stronger, because if it wasn't, why would Bashar al-Assad change his behavior if last year's did not work?
ABC's Karen Travers. In fact, you heard Defense Secretary Mattis say at the Pentagon a short time ago that Assad did not get the message last year. And so the U.S. struck back harder, having Britain and France join in. And the U.S. is confident that these targets that were struck tonight are going to help in the deterrent effect that the president was seeking. Let's head back to the Pentagon Live with ABC's Stephanie Ramos, who is there. Talk about the impact that the defense secretary and others are hoping that these strikes will have.
Absolutely, Aaron. They're hoping that this airstrike makes more of an impact compared to last year. At the same time, we heard from Secretary Mattis, who said a little over double the number of weapons this year was used compared to last year. He also mentioned that there were manned aircraft involved. This was a much this airstrike was on a much larger scale compared to last year. And you know that this past week there has been so much speculation about this possible strike by the U.S. military, and it took a lot longer compared to last year. Last year's strike happened within the span of just 3 days after a chemical attack in Syria, but this is why there were a lot of military options provided to the president as to how the West should act. And as you mentioned, this was a combined effort with France and the UK. Now, some of those target areas that was mentioned by General Dunford was that scientific research center. The goal there to destroy the Syrian regime's chemical weapons research development facility. Also, a chemical weapons storage facility was targeted, which was one of the options that we had discussed here at the Pentagon over the last couple of days. Would that be a something that the U.S. military would strike. The fear was that the chemicals being housed there could possibly disperse and affect the people, the civilians there in that area. But that was a facility that was targeted. We did hear from General Dunford, who said that it was they kept civilians and foreign forces in mind when carrying out this attack. Those foreign forces being the Russians, they did not want to escalate any type of tension that they may have with the Russians, and of course using that deconfliction line that was put in place with 2016 to communicate with the Russians to make sure that they were clear from that airspace there in that area tonight.
It deconflict the airspace, but the U.S. was careful to say it did not coordinate targets with the Russians. We're speaking to ABC's Stephanie Ramos, who's with us from the Pentagon. Stephanie, Defense Secretary Mattis saying he became confident only yesterday in the evidence that a chemical attack had in fact been carried out. He said he is confident that chlorine was used and maybe sarin.
Absolutely, and we did hear from Secretary Mattis on the Hill yesterday, where he at that point he said he wasn't the U.S. wasn't absolutely certain that a chemical weapon had been used, but we heard from him tonight being certain that it was, and reiterated what he said a few days ago, that the use of chemical weapons is inexcusable. He also said the goal of the U.S. there in Syria is to defeat ISIS. That's why we have almost 2,000 troops there right now, but the U.S. just can't stand by and watch Assad's regime use chemical weapons against its people, and this is why the U.S. is stepping in, but this time around stepping in with France and the U.K., not doing it alone. And you also heard from General Dunford and Secretary Mattis saying that this will be a sustained response if Assad continues to use chemical weapons. So we'll just have to wait and see if this airstrike tonight makes much of an impact on Assad.
ABC's Stephanie Ramos with us from the Pentagon. A sustained response, the president promised, but for now, this wave of airstrikes, General Dunford said, is over. Defense Secretary Mattis called it a one-time shot that has sent a very strong message to deter Assad from using chemical weapons. I'm Aaron Katursky. You're listening to live coverage from ABC News. I want to bring back, if we could, Perry Kamak, formerly of the State Department, now at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Perry, a moment ago we received a message from the Russian ambassador to the United States who said the worst apprehensions have come true. Our warnings have been left unheard. And he said such actions will not be left without consequences. The Russians really going to do anything?
You know, I suspect actually in Moscow they're breathing a little bit of a sigh of relief. I think what they really were worried about was a kind of multi-day sustained campaign. Clearly there'll be a kind of diplomatic reaction, but this is actually quite a bit more modest than what the president himself was threatening just a couple days ago, saying, something to the effect of "Get ready, Russia, our missiles are coming."
Wanted to ask you about that. Given what the defense secretary outlined actually happened tonight in conjunction with France and Britain, how does it square with the president's public pronouncements of earlier this week?
Well, it really doesn't. I think Secretary Mattis made pretty clear that this is very narrowly limited to the production and use of chemical weapons. I'm not sure it really does much to change the contours of the conflict itself. The Duma attack a week ago was horrific, something like 70 people killed, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that 500,000 Syrians have died in this war. So even if the Syrian army is deterred from the use of chemical weapons, and I think we all hope it is, that doesn't necessarily kind of change the outcome in any material way.
Perry Kamak, a former State Department official and now at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. And ABC's Tom Rivers is staffing our foreign desk in London. As we've heard, the British and French forces contributed to this attack. The defense secretary did not get into the specific roles that each military played. But Tom, so far, it's the middle of the night there, so no official reaction, but each of the country's leaders has sent statements.
Exactly, and talking about they were not going into it for regime change, very specifically going after chemical weapons. Interesting as well, Defense Secretary sitting here in London listening to that, to that briefing, the question about evidence, and Defense Secretary Mattis saying yesterday we went from I think we might have a chemical attack here to no, I have proof positive. The attack, one wave. It is over now. And it really does raise the question, why was the attack tonight? Why wasn't the attack planned for maybe a week after the International Watchdog Chemical Agent team goes in tomorrow? And if they go in tomorrow and they say, yes, we have conclusive proof on these vials that this was in fact a chemical attack, I think a lot more people would say, it is entirely justified. There are still question marks internationally over the action that took place tonight.
Tom, I did want to ask you about that because those inspectors from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons were set to arrive tomorrow to take a look at this. There's probably very little evidence left, given that the Russian troops were all over it.
Well, again, if you've seen the pictures of the site, you cannot clean, quote unquote, clean that place up. So and again, you go back to a year ago, there was even talk of going there a month after the fact to look for some traces. So I guess, in layman's terms, I think a week is probably a relatively short period of time. If something is there forensically, these top-notch guys can get in there and determine one way or another what the heck was there. So it's going to be interesting, and they can come forward with a preliminary report, maybe in a few days. The more extensive report's going to take some time, but they should be able to go in there and say, yes, this is the proof positive. Certainly chlorine. What about sarin? We don't know, but I think let them go do their work. I don't know what the holdback is there at all.
We're speaking with ABC's Tom Rivers at our foreign desk in London. A moment ago, Syrian state media confirmed that the Scientific Research Center in Barzeh, north of Damascus, was targeted in the attack. A number of rockets targeting warehouses belonging to the Syrian army and homes were intercepted, according to the Syrian government. The defense secretary did mention that a number of surface-to-air missiles were shot off by the Syrians. The Syrians claim to have intercepted some of what the U.S., France, and Britain threw at Syria, but there has been no confirmation of what those retaliatory strikes may have done. Tom, that the Syrians are now confirming that at least one of the targets the defense secretary mentioned was hit seems to confirm the explosions that eyewitnesses were speaking of in the night sky in Damascus.
Exactly. And as we heard earlier, they knew it was coming. It was certainly telegraphed by a number of days, and they would have certainly taken personnel, you would think, out of locations like this. We think back to some of the things that have been talked about past couple of days. The attack could be light, it could be medium, it could be heavy. I think that the Syrians are going to be pretty thankful that this on the spectrum is in fact pretty limited, pretty light. Will they get the message? How much more territory, Aaron, are they going to go after now? They've recaptured most of the land in Syria now, going on almost 8 years. If they have any inclination to use chemical weapons, they certainly aren't after today. And, of course, there's not a whole lot more they have to fight over.
ABC's Tom Rivers with us from our foreign desk in London. As the U.S., France, and Britain launch military strikes in Syria to punish Bashar al-Assad for a suspected chemical attack, although the U.S. is now fairly certain that chlorine was used, maybe sarin, against civilians on April 7th. President Trump mentioned a deterrent effect that he hoped these strikes would have. There were three main targets: chemical weapons storage facilities. The weapons themselves were not targeted, the Defense Secretary Mattis said tonight, because of fear that they could then spread, that the strikes would have the same effect as the actual deployment of the weapons. There were explosions that eyewitnesses said lit up the skies over Damascus as the president was speaking. We heard a statement from British Prime Minister Theresa May in London that the West had tried every possible diplomatic means to stop Assad from using chemical weapons. So I want to turn back to former State Department official Perry Kamak, who's now at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. were diplomatic efforts ever going to be successful, Perry, in trying to get Assad to stop using chemical weapons? They thought the Russians had taken care of it back in 2013.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I think the Obama administration's efforts several years ago, I mean, I think it did result in the removal of the vast majority of the weapons, but, you know, at least that they had at that point. But either there were, you know, some remnants remaining, or perhaps they even created new agents in the meantime. You know, so I think we are where we are. I think the diplomatic effort had basically run its course. Presumably, the Syrian army has gotten the message this time around. But as I said a little bit earlier, I don't think that actually changes necessarily the trajectory of violence in terms of what the Syrian people are experiencing.
Prime Minister May's statement said, Perry, there is no practicable alternative to the use of force to degrade and deter the use of chemical weapons. She said it is not about intervening in a civil war. It's not about regime change. Why not? Why isn't the West interested in a regime change at this point?
Well, I guess one question would be regime. I mean, there are lots of problems there, but one would be regime change to what? I mean, the Syrian rebels really are weaker now than they've been ever, arguably. You know, there's some concern if you pull Assad himself out of the equation that the thing would kind of collapse like a house of cards. I mean, the Syria is essentially run like a mafia state. And then, of course, there's the question of the Russian and Iranian involvement. So, you know, my suspicion is that Moscow and Tehran will react fairly modestly to these strikes. But, you know, if they had gone on for weeks and weeks, clearly there would be kind of a much more forceful response and a much more dangerous situation from Russia and Iran.
Barry Kamak, formerly of the State Department and now at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The Syrians are now claiming they struck down 13 rockets. The Syrian people, a message on Syrian state television said a moment ago, are defiant and courageous. The Americans have been defeated. And an ongoing scroll on Syrian television describes a cowardly terrorist attack only done for America to save face. I'm Aaron Katersky. You're listening to live coverage from ABC News. The Syrian state television crawl also says that the Russians have proof the April 7th chemical attack is a masquerade. But Defense Secretary James Mattis said he became convinced yesterday that there was in fact a chemical attack using chlorine at the very least, and maybe sarin as well. ABC News White House correspondent Karen Travers is with us now. And Karen, the president certainly has a different view of the Syrians, which said this attack was done for America to save face. President Trump said this was done to deter the Syrians from using chemical weapons.
Yeah, and it's a very similar message, Aaron, to what we heard last year from President Trump. I went back and looked at his remarks after he authorized that strike last April, after the sarin gas attack that very deeply impacted the president. He talked at length on multiple occasions about how moved he was and how troubled he was by the images of families who had been killed or who had been wounded in that attack last year. And last year he said that he authorized that strike because it was in the vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons. Well, now here we are 1 year and 1 week later, and the president is saying the exact same thing, that tonight's strike is meant to establish a deterrent that is in the vital national security interest of the United States. You heard the Defense Secretary James Mattis say this was all meant to dissuade Bashar al-Assad from doing this again, and the president certainly signaling more of a sustained campaign, more of a tough talk when he said that the United States is prepared to keep this up until the Syrian regime stops its use of chemical weapons. Secretary Mattis later said, you know, this is a one-time shot, but if Assad were to use chemical weapons again, this conversation would restart. So not that this is going to be an ongoing military campaign, but essentially that Bashar al-Assad is on notice, that this would just be the beginning if he continues to do what he's done. Now, if the United States has targeted what they say they did in a successful way, they say they're going to significantly degrade Assad's ability to produce, develop, and use chemical weapons.
ABC's Karen Travers, our White House correspondent. We should mention that as the U.S. undertook military action, police departments around the United States started to deploy some counterterrorism officers in strategic places, particularly in large cities. The NYPD in New York said it is monitoring the U.S. military action. No nexus to New York City or any credible threats, but they have deployed counterterror officers just to be safe out of an abundance of caution, as police departments around the country will monitor just to see if there is any reaction here on the home front to military action in Syria. You heard President Trump tonight talk about the campaign to defeat ISIS, which, though losing ground on the battlefield, has a permanent propaganda presence on the internet that continues to inspire bad actors. So the NYPD and other police agencies we've heard are monitoring to see if there's any action on the home front, even though none has been noticed so far. We are also taking a look at Syrian state television, which is mocking the attack that the U.S., France, and Britain launched, saying it was only done so America could save face. We are monitoring, too, the Russian reaction. Russia's ambassador to the U.S. said that actions will not be left without consequences, though there's nothing specific that was mentioned. The U.S., the Pentagon says, opened a deconfliction channel with Russia that has been in use for a couple of years now. It's to deconflict the airspace, so there were no unintended consequences from these airstrikes. There was no coordination, though, with the Russians about targets. To say a word about the targets that were struck, the Pentagon made clear that these were chemical weapons storage facilities. Unlike the strike a year ago that targeted an airfield from which a chemical attack may have been launched, this one targeted storage facilities and command posts. No chemical weapons themselves, however, out of fear that attacking them would have the same effect as deploying them for the civilians. And Defense Secretary Mattis said tonight that he was monitoring and careful not to do anything that could potentially harm civilians. Civilian eyewitnesses in the capital Damascus said that they saw explosions light up the night sky, and also they heard some of the retaliatory fire from the Syrians, which said they fired and struck down 13 incoming missiles. The Pentagon has yet to confirm that, but did say that a few surface-to-air missiles seem to be the only retaliatory conduct undertaken by the Syrians so far. From our foreign desk, ABC's Tom Rivers is with us as the French and British announced their participation in this military action, but careful again, like the president, to say that this is targeted and limited in scope.
Exactly, Aaron. And you think about the theater itself, and as we say tonight, it looks pretty limited. That'll go down pretty well, I think, with the people of France, people here of the UK. Also, you think about the domestic implications. Prime Minister Theresa May, pretty beleaguered, not a very popular leader. Macron, a year down the road, certainly his economic reforms have knocked him down a notch as well. Protests again now on the streets of Paris, some of his economic reforms. So they're both playing, if you will, a walk on a tightrope. They've got to be somewhat in step, obviously, with the U.S., but they have to be mindful that they can't throw all of their backing in with the U.S. because you've got a pretty skeptical population in both countries. So I think that this quote-unquote limited strike tonight, a 1-hour wave, I think it will become a footnote. People will move on. If this were sustained over a number of days, there could well be, for instance, in London, protests going into Hyde Park. There could be protests in Paris. But I think that they're going to roll with the punches and see what Monday brings, some critical analysis. By Tuesday, we're going to have domestic issues once again.
That is ABC's Tom Rivers in London at our foreign desk. Loud explosions rocked Damascus, the sky filled with heavy smoke early Saturday, Syria time, as President Trump announced airstrikes taken in conjunction with the British and the French, targeting chemical weapons storage facilities meant to punish Syria for the recent attack just outside Damascus and to deter President Bashar al-Assad from using chemical weapons again. The president said the U.S. was prepared to sustain this kind of response until the use of chemical weapons stops. For the moment, though, this wave of airstrikes, the Pentagon says, is over. And Defense Secretary Mattis called it a one-time shot that has sent a very strong message to deter Assad from using chemical weapons. Let's get back to the White House correspondent Karen Travers, who's with us live. And Karen, I know you've been monitoring for congressional reaction, and it is certainly mixed tonight.
Not surprising, though, of course. You have a lot of Republicans quickly coming out praising the White House for this strike tonight, saying that this was a proportional response and that there had to be a forceful response to Bashar al-Assad to deter him from, once again, using chemical weapons. The line that most Democrats are using in their criticism is going after the president for his authority on this, saying that by not seeking congressional approval, as Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia says, this is illegal, and that if there isn't a broader strategy for Syria and what the administration is going to do about the Assad regime, this is a reckless strategy. And I think that's what you'll hear Democrats say. Now, notably, they're all saying that the president needs to seek congressional authorization, and he did not do that, of course, but we're not seeing Democrats indicate what they would have done if the president had sought that congressional authority. So yes, they say the president has to hold Assad accountable, has to hold President Putin and Russia accountable for their role in this ongoing civil war and this latest escalation, but at the same time, instead deferring and not saying how they exactly would have come down on this. So I think, not surprising you're seeing the Republicans applauding the president. This is exactly what happened last year when they said this was a very tough response from the Trump administration and a line had to be drawn. But certainly this will be very political over the next couple of days.
Karen Travers, our White House correspondent. I'm Aaron Katursky, and you're listening to live coverage from ABC News. I want to turn to Aaron Stein, who's with the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. Aaron, as your interest area, of course, includes the Syrian conflict, what does this latest contribution mean? If you would put it in some context, it has been very narrow and with limited purpose, according to the three leaders that launched it.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I think the intent was always to keep it narrow because, as much as the U.S. would like, or at least some factions in the U.S. would like to escalate this conflict, the U.S. has troops in the Northeast, and so there's always this risk that if the regime or the Russians interpret this as far larger than it's supposed to be, or it is far larger than it's supposed to be, is that you could risk blowback against American troops on the ground or even retaliation against American planes flying over Syria.
Aaron, is this going to make any difference? The stated goal from President Trump and President Macron and Prime Minister May was to deter Bashar al-Assad's use of chemical weapons. Is that possible through this kind of strike?
History tells us that these types of strikes rarely dissuade sort of leaders from giving up weapons of mass destruction programs. I think what makes Syria unique is that in August 2013, following the first major chemical weapons attack, the Obama administration was able to get them to sign up to the Chemical Weapons Convention. It's obviously clear that they aren't abiding by their commitments, so we're in sort of new territory here. I don't think it will fundamentally alter their interest in chemical weapons. Nothing has to date. It certainly won't alter the trajectory of the war, but it could perhaps make them think twice about using chemical weapons again. And there is some value to that because, as research shows, the use of chemical weapons results in far higher rates of PTSD than even conventional weapons for civilians on the ground, and are far more useful for killing large amounts of people with than conventional weapons.
Aaron, what's your sense of the reaction inside Syria, which knew that this was coming? As you suggest, with the use of chemical weapons, the people of Syria have endured far more than targeted airstrikes on chemical weapons storage facilities. Is there appreciation or excitement that the West is involved, or is this met with some skepticism?
it's very early to tell. I mean, the bombs just stopped dropping. My guess is that this will reinforce that Assad can kill basically with impunity, just so long as he doesn't use weapons of mass destruction. And I think for most people on the ground, they probably just want the fighting to stop. For the combatants, that are fighting the Assad regime, they're probably maybe a little bit dissatisfied that the strike was probably, in their own understanding, much smaller than perhaps the hype leading up to it would have indicated.
Are there prospects here for any kind of change in the status quo? The conflict that has raged for years has taken so many lives, and at this point seems almost a proxy for combatants in other areas.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the unanswered questions. I mean, if the strike is basically in retaliation for the use of chemical weapons, does this in any way enhance the American, I guess, diplomatic leverage to try and end the conflict? And to be honest, there's a lot of uncertainty about this, largely because the main backer and the force for this the diplomatic process was former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. And with Mike Pompeo not yet being confirmed, I mean, the United States doesn't have a Secretary of State at the moment, and so we're largely in limbo about what this means for the diplomatic track because we don't know what the priorities will be for the next Secretary of State.
Aaron Stein is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. Aaron, our thanks to you for your contributions as we continue to follow developments after a military strike that the U.S., Britain, and France undertook against chemical weapons targets in Syria. I'm Aaron Katersky. You're listening to live coverage from ABC News. President Trump announced it this evening, and there were strikes in Syria targeted to chemical weapons storage facilities mainly in and around Damascus and other parts of Syria. This was in response to the April 7th suspected chemical weapons attack that Defense Secretary James Mattis said he is confident now used chlorine and perhaps sarin as well. I want to bring in Steve Simon, if I could, a visiting professor of history at UMass Amherst, a former senior director for Middle Eastern and North African affairs during the Obama administration. Steve, just based on what we've seen so far tonight, your sense of what has gone on and its perhaps wider meaning in context of an ongoing conflict.
Well, it's a difficult question to answer because we still don't know what the scope of the strikes were. The impression I get from speaking to people in the region is that the scope of the strikes was wider than Secretary of Defense Mattis had indicated. In any case, the strikes had to be limited to avoid the possibility of killing Russians, which would push this into an escalatory spiral that would be very difficult to unwind. So, there are limits to the strikes, number one, even if they are large scale. And number two, the Syrians have had plenty of time to move a lot of their assets to safer locations that the United States would view as too risky to hit. So their infrastructure is certainly at risk. Buildings, runways can be cratered. There are thousands of targets that could conceivably be hit, although there aren't enough cruise missiles in the inventory, at least in the fleet right now in the Mediterranean, to actually do that kind of damage. So you'll get serious strikes. The regime will no doubt be impressed. And the regime will no doubt stop using chlorine gas and whatever other toxic substances that they were using in Duma, at least for the time being. Now, the United States has said, President Trump has said that these measures will continue, he said, until the Syrians stop using these weapons. That leaves a bit of ambiguity about whether the strikes will continue indefinitely because how do you know when the regime actually stops using it? I mean, it's a bit of a difficult criterion, but I assume that they'll do these strikes over a very limited period of time with the British and the French. The British and the French aren't going to be interested, I would have thought, in sustained, coordinated airstrikes. That is to say, a long air campaign in Syria. I think they're intending to send a strong signal, and they're trying to keep this, the rationale for the operation, entirely in the domain of non-proliferation. So, the Assad regime has used these terrible weapons. It's against international norms. It's against international law. That transgression needs to be punished. So these strikes are geared towards a very specific thing.
Steve, you've met with President Assad. Is that even possible to deter him? Is this going to have the desired effect?
Well, I think he has been deterred. Now, there are numerous reported instances of chemical weapons use since 2013, when they were used on a large scale in more or less the same area of Syria. But these instances have been small and not widely reported. They look as though they were calibrated to stay just under the radar, just under the threshold of a U.S. or U.S. and allied response. So, I'd have thought he'd simply revert to the same pattern. Now, you asked about the bigger picture. The bigger picture is, in other ways, this war is winding down. So the requirements from a regime perspective, the requirements to use these kinds of weapons are simply going to diminish. There won't really be the need for it. This was, in a way, the last major rebel holdout. And it was important because it was so close to Damascus. And it held out for a long time. So the regime made it a priority once it was pretty clear that they had the Russians on their side to deal with that last vestige of rebellion so close to the capital. But it's gone now. It's over.
But which is cold comfort that there may not be a need for chemical weapons because the war has taken such a brutal toll. But with the West clearly stating tonight, the leaders of Britain, France, and the United States, that their interest is not in regime change here or in engaging in this war, Assad survives this.
Oh, yeah, of course. And, Assad he's fairly self-possessed. He hasn't, so far as we know, he hasn't panicked at any point in this war. And there were moments in this war when the regime didn't quite have its back to the wall, but was under a lot of pressure. And the spring of 2015, when I saw him, was one of those moments. The regime looked as though it was facing some serious problems on the battlefield owing to a shortage of personnel. They lost big cities, Palmyra, big city. They'd lost that to the opposition. They'd lost a big province in the northwest, which is still in the hands of rebels at that time. They really looked like they were back on their heels. But, the regime kept its head. They kept a fairly cool head, and that must have owed to some extent to Assad himself and Assad's resolve. Now, at that time, they might also have known that, they could bring the Russians in if it really got bad. So, they always had a kind of a safety net that maybe obviated panic. But,
indeed,
all in all, I don't think that this is going to, knock his socks off, these strikes.
Steve Simon, who during the Obama administration was the senior director for Middle Eastern and North African Affairs, now a visiting professor of history at UMass Amherst. Steve, our thanks to you to help us understand this military operation in a bit of a wider context of an ongoing civil war in Syria. President Trump announced the military operation taken in conjunction with Britain and France, and loud explosions were nearly simultaneously heard in Syria's capital, Damascus, filling the sky with heavy smoke on an early Saturday morning in Syria. I'm Aaron Katersky. You're listening to live coverage from ABC News. The Pentagon has outlined the targets of this strike. It is finished for now. The airstrikes, at least for this round, are over. ABC's Stephanie Ramos is with us from the Pentagon. Stephanie, these strikes were intended to hit chemical weapons storage facilities mainly.
That's right, Aaron, and that's what we heard from Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They outlined, they described the areas that were targeted, as you mentioned, that chemical weapons storage facility, also a scientific research center, and a command post. As we heard from Secretary Mattis, he said he wanted to send a message, and he wanted that to stick. Secretary Mattis saying that if Assad does not get this message, it will be a sustained response. So here's what we know. There were manned aircraft used, also about 120 missiles that were launched from at least one Navy ship out there in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. Now, the Pentagon right now is not telling us what type of aircraft was used. We'll know more tomorrow morning, but we also know there were also some Syrian surface-to-air missiles fired at some of these aircraft, but there are no U.S. casualties or allied casualties at this point. But again, as you've mentioned, Secretary Mattis was very confident that chemical weapons were used in Syria. Definitely chlorine, possibly sarin, but he said he felt comfortable enough to go forward with these strikes tonight.
What about the assets used? It didn't appear that Secretary Mattis got into it a whole lot, but it's clear that these were, in all likelihood, cruise missiles, although the defense secretary and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs mentioned, Stephanie, that some manned aircraft were used in the operation as well.
Absolutely. He did mention that the manned aircraft and these cruise missiles from that one Navy ship. Now, we know that a couple of days ago, these assets were already moving into the region. The USS Donald Cook, that Navy ship, that Navy destroyer, they're just south of Cyprus. And we also know that that France and Britain were also moving their assets. The aircraft and ships were already in that region, getting into position, preparing for this, and some that were already there. But as you mentioned, this assets were moving there, and this took quite a bit of time. The defense secretary and other U.S. officials having a number of meetings at the White House to present President Trump with his military options. We heard from UN Ambassador Nikki Haley today at the UN Security Council praising President Trump, saying that she was unbelievably proud of him for taking his time, for how he's handled this situation and not letting others rush him into any decision. And we saw that compared to last year. Last year, after the chemical attack in Syria, it took 3 days for the U.S. to respond, and of course we've seen this time around it take about a week. So we'll just have to wait and see what type of impact this does have in the region, but I can tell you what we don't know. What we were hoping to learn more about tomorrow is the specifics of the planes that participated in this strike. We don't have an assessment either of civilian casualties. We know the U.S. wanted to minimize that as much as possible. We heard that from General Dunford, but we also don't know again, what type of response we'll see from the Russians or Syrians. A lot of details need to be sorted out still, but this brings us further into this regional conflict there in Syria.
Stephanie, I was struck by something Defense Secretary Mattis said, in that Syria didn't get the message last time, and so this strike was harder. And this is the biggest military strike the U.S., especially under President Trump, has taken against Assad.
That's correct. And Secretary Mattis said that he wanted to send a clear message to Assad not to perpetrate another chemical weapons attack. That strike tonight separately demonstrates this international resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used on anyone in any circumstance. We heard from Secretary Mattis when he was on Capitol Hill saying that the U.S. is there to defeat ISIS, but the U.S. will not stand by and watch a regime continue to use chemical weapons. So this sends the message to us that the U.S. will continue to participate in attacks like this if these chemical weapons continue to be used. But the secretary urging quote, responsible nations to condemn the Assad regime and join in, quote, firm resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used again. And of course, the president, the U.S. officials here, the defense secretary, everyone hoping that message came across tonight together with other nations. And we knew that a couple of days ago, that this would likely be a coalition strike. And it was, together with France and the UK. So we'll have to wait and see how much of an impact it does actually have in Syria.
All right, Stephanie Ramos with us from the Pentagon, and Stephanie is monitoring for any new developments about attacks which are now over. Defense Secretary Mattis and General Joseph Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, were careful to say that this wave of strikes is now over. The operation has concluded, although President Trump did say that the U.S. was prepared to sustain this kind of response should it be necessary if the Syrian president does use chemical weapons again. We have noted tonight, though, the use of chemical weapons on April 7th came as the last stronghold of rebel fighters was coming to a close. And so I want to turn back to Aaron Stein at the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. Is there just going to be no need for Bashar al-Assad to use these kinds of weapons again?
You can never quite tell. I mean, I always find it difficult in the head of a man who decides to murder his own people and use chemical weapons. I think what your previous guest, Steve, was talking about was this Damascus suburb that has been besieged for years, has recently come under attack by joint Russian and regime offensive, and there was one final rebel group that was holding out in there, and it's ultimately that rebel group that was holding out that perpetuated, that set in motion the use of either chlorine and a nerve agent, or just chlorine. It's unclear at the moment. But they're being bussed up towards the northern border with Turkey, and so you do have pockets that are left outside of regime control in the northeast, which is largely guaranteed by the United States, sort of along the northern border west of the Euphrates River, which is guaranteed by Turkey, and extending down in through Idlib province. And so the question always becomes, does the regime stop fighting and begin to negotiate, or will it try and then push into these places that are guaranteed by external powers? And the question still hangs out there.
Particularly if Russia or Iran or, I guess, Assad opt to retaliate.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the limiting factors, and one of the things I know that guided the U.S. debate, was to try and, as I call it, to get the Goldilocks option, which was to increase the lethality from the last strike, basically about a year ago, which used 59 cruise missiles, where this time, early reports say it was well over 100. And then you obviously this time around had a Trump administration, largely I think because they've been in power a little longer and have sort of figured out how to govern, and was able to figure out that you can put together a coalition and you could get basically French and British support for military action, and therefore it makes it more international and more robust in the response. And so that's more or less where you're at, because the U.S. then had to debate, if you push too hard, do you put your 2,000 soldiers in the Northeast at risk and perhaps risk Russian retaliation? But if you don't push enough, will Assad get the message? And so that's more or less where the administration came down on, and we'll have to see. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons the president used the language that he did. It was a one-off strike. It was relatively small. It was just one night, but he's clearly indicated that if the United States gets reliable intelligence that this happens again, he'll do it again. And so it's clearly an effort to deter.
Aaron Stein is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. Aaron, our thanks to you for helping us understand this strike in its broader context. I want to return to the Pentagon. ABC's Louis Martinez is on his way there for us, and we'll get more information about how this strike unfolded, the targets that were hit. But right now, let's turn to our White House correspondent, Karen Travers, who has been monitoring some of the congressional reaction to all of this. Because, Karen, though the president has his supporters in his own party, the Democrats are already, by and large, lined up in opposition.
And opposition not in the sense of what President Trump did and why he did it tonight, that this was sending a message to deter Bashar al-Assad from using chemical weapons again, as the White House and the Pentagon have said tonight. But they're taking issue with how the president went about this by noting that he did not ask for congressional authorization. You are seeing Republicans just universally applauding the president for this tough stance, but Democrats taking issue with the method. Tim Kaine, senator from Virginia, one-time vice presidential contender, said that this strike was illegal. Others are echoing a similar remark, but, Aaron, I think it's notable that they're not saying that if President Trump had come to Congress, asked for approval for this strike, they're not saying what they would have done, just that, like Cory Booker, senator from New Jersey, says he's deeply concerned that this administration is conducting military operations without a strategy or the necessary congressional authorization. I think you'll expect to hear a drumbeat from from Democrats about this in the coming days. They'll say we stood by last year when the president did this. That was meant to be a deterrent for chemical weapons used by Bashar al-Assad. That was said to be in the vital national security interest. Now here we are 1 year later. The president is quite literally saying the same thing, and Bashar al-Assad has done the same thing too, and the president has not gone to Congress to ask them to weigh in and have some input and advice on this.
ABC's Karen Travers, our White House correspondent, as President Trump announced airstrikes in retaliation for Syria's alleged use of chemical weapons. Defense Secretary Mattis said tonight that he became convinced yesterday that chlorine had been used, and the U.S. was still assessing whether sarin had been used as well in the attack in the Damascus suburbs on April 7th, 1 week ago. ABC's Louis Martinez is with us from the Pentagon now. And Louis, the targets that the Pentagon selected along with France and Britain for this military operation were very specific chemical weapons storage facilities.
That's right, Aaron. There were these three facilities, two in the Damascus area, one in Western Homs. They have to do with the production of chemical weapons. One was a chemical storage area, and the third was a research and development facility. You heard General Dunford say that there were additional sites that could have been targeted, but they chose these three particularly because they wanted to minimize the chance of civilian casualties. But what you're hearing from Secretary Mattis right now is that this is a one-shot deal right now, but the message is intended to be clear to Syria that they should not be using chemical weapons in the future. And I think that the idea here is that if they catch wind that Syria is doing that, they may target these additional facilities. And I think that's the threat that's being pushed on them right now.
Louis, the Pentagon seemed to express some confidence that the goals were achieved tonight, but there was no official assessment about the intensity of these strikes and whether they did the job they were supposed to do.
Well, what we do know is that the number of ordnance, those would be missiles or bombs that were used in tonight's airstrikes, were roughly double what was used last year. We remember that there were 59 cruise missiles that were launched at one air base last year. That was the base where aircraft had taken off for that sarin attack that led to those airstrikes. This time around, three different facilities, complex mission involving both U.S., British, and French aircraft that we can assume, since General Dunford said that they were the ones involved in this mission. We can also assume that there were Tomahawk missiles launched from at least one Navy vessel in the eastern Mediterranean. But it takes time to assess what they call the bomb damage assessment. That's one of the reasons why we're not going to get this new Pentagon briefing at 9 a.m. tomorrow. And we expect to get more briefing details about what kinds of missiles were used, what the damage assessment is to the facilities themselves. But it seems pretty clear that from what we heard from Dunford and Mattis, that they seem, or they feel that early indications are that they hit those targets well.
Syria, at least on state television, said that they were able to successfully shoot down 13 incoming missiles. Was there any other information about retaliatory strikes?
Well, we did hear that from General Dunford that the only indication of retaliatory strikes that he was aware of was the firing of some surface-to-air missiles. This is anti-aircraft missile batteries launching missiles at incoming aircraft or missiles potentially. He said that there were no American casualties or involved, or Allied casualties for that matter, involved in this, which indicates that those missile firings were unsuccessful. What we did hear from Secretary Mattis at the end of his briefing was that he cautioned that there was likely going to be a disinformation campaign from Syria. He said, we've seen them do this. We know that they're going to try to do this. And he spoke, actually, this incident, this chemical weapons attack from last week is an example of that. We know U.S. intelligence determining pretty quickly that there was some type of chemical weapons attack that occurred, but you heard from the Syrians denials. If anything, they said that there was a hoax involved, and similar language used by the Russians to deny that there was an incident that kind of provoked the retaliatory strikes that we saw tonight. But nothing yet, but that is a major concern for U.S. officials. It was something that when I spoke to officials this week, they constantly spoke about the concerns that either Russia or Syria might conduct some type of retaliatory action against any potential airstrikes. When you talk to Navy officials, they were concerned that their vessels might be too close to shore, so they didn't want any disclosures of where their ships may be because they want to be out of range of any sort of anti-ship missiles or potentially any kind of Russian or Syrian aircraft that might be targeting them. They were concerned about a manned aircraft. You don't want to expose your pilots to any potential missile strikes. And so that's one of the reasons why we believe that tonight the potentially B-1 bombers were used to launch long-range cruise missiles, and that these cruise missiles were fired from outside of Syrian territory. So that's some of the concerns that they're worrying about, but for now it seems like it was a very limited response so far, but of course they're going to keep an eye out to see what develops over the coming days.
We're speaking with ABC's Louis Martinez at the Pentagon, and to be clear, the U.S. kept a deconfliction channel with the Russians open, the same one that's been in operation for a couple of years now.
Yep, that is a very valuable tool for both the U.S. and Russia in the very busy skies over Syria. They want to avoid any kind of potential collisions. That was why they initially put that system into place. But what we learned tonight was that system was used yet again. But unlike the last year's strikes where the U.S. notified the Russian military that there were incoming strikes at that one particular airfield, particularly because there were Russian personnel on that base. This time around, the only notification was that there would be aircraft flying over Syria. General Dunford stressing that there was no coordination over the target areas that were being targeted by the U.S. and its allies in these strikes, and that very little notification otherwise, other than just what that hotline is being used for, notifying that there will be aircraft over the airspace.
Louis, did we get a sense of the division of labor in this coordinated campaign involving 3 different armed forces?
You know, it's unclear what exactly the level of participation was. We know that there were British aircraft that took off for this mission. There are British aircraft stationed in Cyprus. There are French aircraft in the region as well. There is a permanent French air base in the United Arab Emirates, and there's another one. There's more aircraft in neighboring Jordan. We don't know particularly how many aircraft were used for this mission, but when you fly integrated missions, you know, it requires a lot of training in terms of, because you do have different types of weapon systems and aircraft. But as one official told me this morning, you know, it's not like we don't train with these guys all the time. This is what we do. This is why we work with international partners to make sure that we can interact with them when we have to. But we expect to get more details about the level of effort, as you say, from these other 2 countries tomorrow. But you did see one thing that was interesting. As General Dunford and Secretary Mattis came out into the briefing room here at the Pentagon, General Dunford motioned to the two defense attaches for the British Embassy and the French Embassy to join them on the podium there on the dais to show the resolve of this allied commitment.
Louis, one more for you, if I could, as we speak to ABC's Louis Martinez, our man at the Pentagon. Talk about the evolution of Defense Secretary Mattis's thinking during the course of this week, because we heard almost right away in tweets from President Trump that there would have to be some kind of retaliation. He announced that a response would be coming, but it was left to Defense Secretary Mattis, it seemed, to try and stop the rush and slow things down out of fear of possible Russian or Iranian moves that could be made in conjunction with whatever the U.S. ended up doing.
You're right, Aaron. Secretary Mattis was on the Hill yesterday. He kind of expressed some cautionary words about any potential military action in Syria. We must remember that there are Russian forces in Syria. There are Iranian forces in Syria. They're there backing Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime against the rebel groups. And the concern that Secretary Mattis had was that what happens if these forces get involved? His concern being a greater conflict beyond just targeting Syria's chemical weapons program. You could strike at them in a limited capacity, but what if this leads to a greater conflict involving those forces? And that's what he wanted to avoid. His concern was, okay, we do these missile strikes, but what happens next? And you kind of heard actually at his Pentagon briefing tonight some of that. Because he expressed that these missile strikes were very, very specifically targeted only at the chemical weapons program and that they were not intended to go beyond that. And he refocused again that the only reason that the United States is in Syria right now, let's not forget there were 2,000 American service members serving in Syria, mainly in eastern Syria. They are the ones who are working with local ground forces in the fight against ISIS. They've had tremendous success over the last 2 years or so. That is the focus of the U.S. mission in Syria. But tonight, the warning to Syrian President Assad not to use chemical weapons again, the message from President Trump that this is an outrage, that this is not how civilized nations act, and that the United States and its allies are working to prevent this use of chemical weapons again.
Louis Martinez at the Pentagon for ABC News. Louis, thanks. And we will, of course, keep listening for updates from the Pentagon about how this strike unfolded, what assets specifically were used, the number of munitions, although, as Louis says, it seems to have been about double what was used a year ago when the U.S. punished Syria for using chemical weapons in an attack on an airfield where the chemical weapons attack may have originated. The president said he also had a message to send tonight to Iran and to Russia. The president said, what kind of nation wants to be associated with the mass murder of innocent men, women, and children? Let's return to our White House correspondent, ABC's Karen Travers. The president has mentioned this kind of thing before, where he has called out Russia especially for its association with President Assad, but he has also, in other ways, tried to reach out to Vladimir Putin and establish some kind of relationship with Russia that he says has been lagging.
It's been an interesting balancing act for the president and White House officials who have to respond to what the president has said. You know, you'll remember a couple weeks ago, the president said that he spoke to Vladimir Putin after his re-election and congratulated him on that win, which of course was quite a controversial statement for the president to make, and one that we're told he was not supposed to make at all. And he also said at that time that he had talked to Vladimir Putin about sitting down and having a meeting. So you have this one current where the president very frequently says he wants to have a good relationship with Russia. He thinks that is in the interest of the United States, and then blasts the Russia probe as being one of the big sticking points as to why it is a bad relationship with Russia right now. He says previous presidencies have tried to set that reset button. He blames President Obama. He blames Hillary Clinton, but he says he can do it. Now, you have on the other hand, Republicans on Capitol Hill, Aaron, who have called for the president to be tougher on Vladimir Putin, who say he doesn't make statements about Russia's election meddling. He doesn't make tough statements about Russia's incursion into Ukraine, Crimea, places like that, and that recent poisoning of a former Russian spy in the UK. So they want to see a tough stance. Now, you see this week, the president making that in a way, but in a way that concerned people on Capitol Hill, because it was the president issuing threats to Russia in relation to Syria. Remember, of course, it was only 2 days ago where the president tweeted, "Get ready, Russia, because missiles were going to be coming to Syria." Aaron, that was a tweet that was widely criticized, not just because it seemed to be provoking Russia, but also because it seemed to be telegraphing the president's military position and what he was going to do next. And he dialed that back a bit, but that statements about Russia's responsibility with this chemical attack and their ongoing support for Bashar al-Assad, that is something that the president has not backed down from, and that's been notable this week. I think the big line the president said immediately after the attack was that there would be a big price to pay for those who were responsible. He was asked this week if he thought Vladimir Putin is part of that, and he said yes, and he'll have to pay a price too. That, I think, is the next big question. We knew the president was going to authorize some sort of military action on Syria, a matter of when, not if. He announced that tonight. Now, part two, if you will be what is the conversation with Russia? Because everybody was making threats, drawing lines this week. The president has gone ahead and taken this military action. How does Russia respond?
Yeah, because ultimately, what does this mean? It may well have the deterrent effect that the president and allies are desiring, but there is still a mess in the region and potential conflicts diplomatically without a confirmed Secretary of State.
Yeah, no confirmed Secretary of State. You've got the acting Secretary of State right now, who had been Rex Tillerson's deputy. You have a new National Security Advisor, John Bolton, who, of course, has a reputation and a history of pursuing more of a hawkish position on foreign policy and military strikes. He's somebody that's made tough statements about the need for U.S. military action in Syria. Big fan of what the president did last April with that Tomahawk missile strike. And, you also, I think if you look at this, too, you have the president who's making this threat that President Putin, Russia, and Iran are responsible for backing what he called Animal Assad. And the president's trying to thread the needle a bit here, because they're trying to say at the White House that there's a couple different things happening in Syria. So on the one hand, he's putting pressure on Russia while trying to coordinate with them. And that's obviously very complex because of Russia's support for President Assad. You also have the president just 2 weeks ago saying he wanted to bring out U.S. troops from Syria. And the White House says he can still say that. He can still want to wind down the U.S. Fight against ISIS there, which they say is separate, of course, from this Syrian civil war, which previous administration tried to solve diplomatically. This administration doesn't seem to have a coherent set diplomatic strategy to do that. So you've got a lot of balls in the air for the administration right now, and I don't think a lot of clarity on exactly what the driving message is here and what the strategy is that they're hoping to pursue in the short and the long term.
ABC's Karen Travers, our White House correspondent. As the United States, France, and Britain launch a military operation aimed at Syrian chemical weapons targets, meant, President Trump said tonight, to deter Syrian President Bashar al-Assad from using chemical weapons again, as he is suspected of doing 1 week ago on April 7th in the suburbs outside Damascus. The targets that were hit tonight were mainly chemical weapons storage facilities, not the weapons themselves, so they didn't have that same kind of impact as actually deploying the weapons. And I want to turn to ABC's Tom Rivers, who's at our foreign desk in London. Tom, there is some skepticism, I know, among the British public about the efficacy of these kinds of strikes and whether they can really change things on the ground for the people of Syria.
You're absolutely right, Aaron. In fact, even people in the conservative ruling party have been saying this kind of action, to have any real impact, should have been done 5 years ago. I'll use the analogy. It's 18-2. It's the bottom of the ninth. There's 2 outs, and you're doing this now. What do you expect for an outcome? Theresa May, through a statement, says there was no practical alternative to the use of force tonight. Many people would say, well, yes, there are a variety of other things you could have done. And in isolation, how effective was hitting 2 storage warehouses and a lab tonight? we'll have to wait weeks, maybe even months down the road to see. We've heard repeatedly tonight as well the fact that Assad certainly is in the ascendancy after this long, long civil war. And I guess his disposition to use chemical weapons again probably is very, very low. There would be no reason for him to use these again as he consolidates various parts now of most of Syria. So it's going to be a mixed picture. And I think a lot of the criticism, we'll hear it on Monday in Parliament. And assuming this is this one first wave and that's it, it'll go away. It'll be semi-forgotten. But I think the fact that it was fairly limited, a lot of relief as well among many people here that were fearing the possibility that things could escalate, and it doesn't appear to be the case tonight.
ABC's Tom Rivers with us from our foreign desk in London. Britain, France, and the United States launched a joint airstrike on Syria. 3 targets were said to have been in the scope, including a scientific research center, a chemical weapons storage facility, and a military command post. The attack was in response to Syrian President Assad's regime and his recent alleged chemical weapons attack that killed innocent civilians. Of course, the path to these attacks traces back years. It was last year that President Trump ordered a strike on an airfield in response to another chemical attack, and there have been chemical attacks alleged against President Assad's regime in the intervening months, and yet the horrific images associated with the attack of April 7th seems to have driven President Trump to this moment. He addressed the nation earlier tonight.
My fellow Americans, a short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. A combined operation with the armed forces of France and the United Kingdom is now underway. We thank them both. Tonight, I want to speak with you about why we have taken this action. 1 year ago, Assad launched a savage chemical weapons attack against his own innocent people. The United States responded with 58 missile strikes that destroyed 20% of the Syrian Air Force. Last Saturday, the Assad regime again deployed chemical weapons to slaughter innocent civilians, this time in the town of Douma, near the Syrian capital of Damascus. This massacre was a significant escalation in a pattern of chemical weapons use by that very terrible regime. The evil and the despicable attack left mothers and fathers, infants and children thrashing in pain and gasping for air. These are not the actions of a man. They are crimes of a monster instead. Following the horrors of World War I a century ago, civilized nations joined together to ban chemical warfare. Chemical weapons are uniquely dangerous, not only because they inflict gruesome suffering, but because even small amounts can unleash widespread devastation. The purpose of our actions tonight is to establish a strong deterrent against the production, spread, and use of chemical weapons. Establishing this deterrent is a vital national security interest of the United States. The combined American, British, and French response to these atrocities will integrate all instruments of our national power, military, economic, and diplomatic. We are prepared to sustain this response until the Syrian regime stops its use of prohibited chemical agents. I also have a message tonight for the two governments most responsible for supporting, equipping, and financing the criminal Assad regime. To Iran and to Russia, I ask, What kind of a nation wants to be associated with the mass murder of innocent men, women, and children? The nations of the world can be judged by the friends they keep. No nation can succeed in the long run by promoting rogue states, brutal tyrants, and murderous dictators. In 2013, President Putin and his government promised the world that they would guarantee the elimination of Syria's chemical weapons. Assad's recent attack and today's response are the direct result of Russia's failure to keep that promise. Russia must decide if it will continue down this dark path or if it will join with civilized nations as a force for stability and peace. Hopefully, someday we'll get along with Russia and maybe even Iran, but maybe not. I will say this: the United States has a lot to offer. With the greatest and most powerful economy in the history of the world. In Syria, the United States, with but a small force being used to eliminate what is left of ISIS, is doing what is necessary to protect the American people. Over the last year, nearly 100% of the territory once controlled by the so-called ISIS Caliphate in Syria and Iraq has been liberated and eliminated. The United States has also rebuilt our friendships across the Middle East. We have asked our partners to take greater responsibility for securing their home region, including contributing large amounts of money for the resources, equipment, and all of the anti-ISIS effort. Increased engagement from our friends, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Egypt, and others, can ensure that Iran does not profit from the eradication of ISIS. America does not seek an indefinite presence in Syria under no circumstances. As other nations step up their contributions, we look forward to the day when we can bring our warriors home, and great warriors they are. Looking around our very troubled world, Americans have no illusions. We cannot purge the world of evil or act everywhere there is tyranny. No amount of American blood or treasure can produce lasting peace and security in the Middle East. It's a troubled place. We will try to make it better, but it is a troubled place. The United States will be a partner and a friend, but the fate of the region lies in the hands of its own people. In the last century, we looked straight into the darkest places of the human soul. We saw the anguish that can be unleashed and the evil that can take hold. By the end of World War I, more than 1 million people had been killed or injured by chemical weapons. We never want to see that ghastly specter return. So today, the nations of Britain, France, and the United States of America have marshaled their righteous power against barbarism and brutality. Tonight I ask all Americans to say a prayer for our noble warriors and our allies as they carry out their missions. We pray that God will bring comfort to those suffering in Syria. We pray that God will guide the whole region toward a future of dignity and of peace. And we pray that God will continue to watch over and bless the United States of America. Thank you and good night. Thank you.
President Trump earlier tonight announcing the second attack of his presidency on Syria, this one, as he made clear, meant to punish the Syrian government after it was accused of using chemical weapons. And in Syria, the residents of Damascus woke to the sounds of multiple explosions shaking the city and in cities beyond, there were at least 3 targets that the United States, the French, and the British wanted to hit chemical weapons storage facilities. The Syrian state television said that government air defense systems were activated, and a moment ago said they were able to shoot down 13 rockets in Kiswa. This is just south of the capital, Damascus. The U.S. did not confirm the nature of the retaliatory strikes, but did say that the anti-missile batteries were activated in Syria. They did not comment on the success of those retaliatory strikes. ABC's Karen Travers, our White House correspondent, is with us. And the president, as he began talking, seemed to make a calculation because he has always desired to limit American military involvement. And he was careful to say that the American military cannot solve the problems of the world. But there were some acts that he finds far too barbaric to go unanswered.
Right, but don't call it a red line, Aaron, as we've certainly seen the president stay away from over the last year, not wanting to repeat what he felt was a mistake of his predecessor, Barack Obama, talking about a red line in Syria. Last year, when that sarin gas attack happened and the president launched the military strike, the president was asked about red lines, and he said that Bashar al-Assad had crossed many lines. Tonight, he was making the point that this cannot happen again, that Bashar al-Assad has to be limited for his ability and the inclination to use chemical weapons on his own people. But I think you're right, where he talks about the Middle East, and he says that this has to be up to the countries in the region to handle their own fate, that the Americans will be a partner and a friend and try to make the region a better place. But he doesn't say exactly how his administration is going to go about that. I think another line that is certainly going to get the headlines is when the president said America does not seek an indefinite presence in Syria under no circumstances, because you have him on the one hand saying we are ready to continue a sustained response if Assad does this again, or if there is not some dramatic change to behavior and the support that he's getting from Russia and Iran. But on the other hand, this is the president who just 2 weeks ago said he wanted to pull the 2,000 U.S. troops out of Syria. So how to square those two statements together? The president is saying that they want to be there, they want to have an impact in this civil war, but not with a permanent military presence. That, of course, Aaron raises the question of, so what's the diplomatic strategy? Nothing in the president's remarks, brief remarks tonight, indicate what that will be. There was no sense from the White House in the last couple of days of, if the president launched this strike, what was the next step and what would be different that would, after sending that strong message to Assad, perhaps set a course for regime change or a diplomatic conversation once again of bringing parties to the table to come up with some way to solve the Syrian civil war. We heard more from the Pentagon tonight about that, but again, no details, just saying this has to be solved.
ABC's Karen Travers, our White House correspondent, after President Trump announced for the second time that he has ordered an attack on Syria. This one was done with allies. The British and the French were involved, but not all European allies went along. ABC's Tom Rivers is at our foreign desk in London. The Germans, for example, though they decried the use of chemical weapons, refused to get involved.
Exactly, Aaron. The Germans stepping back, sitting it out. The Italians, the same thing. Part of that is the fatigue. Part of that is the lessons of history, of Libya, of Iraq. And the people on the continent really don't have a stomach for something of this nature. But you're right. It was a coalition, a very tiny one. And it sounds good. France, Britain, the U.S., of course, the U.S. doing the heavy lifting. I'd be surprised if Britain, find out tomorrow, maybe fired maybe a couple cruise missiles. But they were there. Interesting as well, we're getting from the foreign ministry in Moscow now. Very predictable, but I'll just read you a couple of lines. Coming out of Moscow, the foreign ministry condemning the attack. They say that Damascus has come under attack by U.S., French, and UK forces at a time when Syria is returning to peaceful life after battling terrorist aggression for years. So there you go. That's the reaction starting from Moscow. And obviously, we're going to be hearing more this weekend. And, of course, we turn the corner into the new week. This is not going away. And critical voices were going to be heard certainly at the beginning of the week until we move on to other things. But, again, the fact that Parliament here wanted a piece of this. They wanted to debate it. They wanted this thing to maybe be put off for a few days so they could actually vote on it. Not the case. And that has really angered a lot of politicians, opposition politicians, Lib Dems, Labor Party, and even people in the ruling Conservative Party.
ABC's Tom Rivers with us from our foreign desk in London as Britain and France join the United States in a coordinated strike intended to show, the defense secretary said, was resolve among international partners in the face of the alleged use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime. The strikes were carried out with ship-based cruise missiles and manned aircraft. They targeted facilities associated with Syria's chemical weapons. Defense Secretary Mattis addressed the nation from the Pentagon about this operation.
Earlier today, President Trump directed the U.S. military to conduct operations in consonance with our allies to destroy the Syrian regime's chemical weapons research, development, and production capability. Tonight, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States took decisive action to strike the Syrian chemical weapons infrastructure. Clearly, the Assad regime did not get the message last year. This time, our allies and we have struck harder. Together, we have sent a clear message to Assad and his murderous lieutenants that they should not perpetrate another chemical weapons attack for which they will be held accountable. The 70 nations in the Defeat ISIS coalition remain committed to defeating ISIS in Syria. The strike tonight separately demonstrates international resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used on anyone under any circumstance in contravention of international law. I want to emphasize that these strikes are directed at the Syrian regime. In conducting these strikes, we have gone to great lengths to avoid civilian and foreign casualties. But it is a time for all civilized nations to urgently unite in ending the Syrian civil war by supporting the United Nations-backed Geneva peace process. In accordance with the Chemical Weapons Convention prohibiting the use of such weapons, we urge responsible nations to condemn the Assad regime and to join us in our firm resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used again. General Dunford will provide a military update.
Hey, good evening. I'm joined by our French attaché, Brigadier General Montague, and our British attaché, Air Vice Marshal Gavin Parker. Secretary Mattis has just outlined the policy and legal framework for tonight's strike in Syria. I'll address the strike from the military dimension. At 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, French, British, and U.S. forces struck targets in Syria in support of President Trump's objective to deter the future use of chemical weapons. Our forces were integrated throughout the planning and execution of the operation. The targets that were struck and destroyed were specifically associated with the Syrian regime's chemical weapons program. We also selected targets that would minimize the risk to innocent civilians. The first target was a scientific research center located in the greater Damascus area. This military facility was a Syrian center for the research, development, production, and testing of chemical and biological warfare technology. The second target was a chemical weapons storage facility west of Homs. We assessed that this was the primary location of Syrian sarin and precursor production equipment. The third target, which was in the vicinity of the second target, contained both a chemical weapons equipment storage facility and an important command post. U.S., British, and French naval and air forces were involved in the operation, and for reasons of operational security, I won't be more specific this evening. Before we take questions, I'd like to address how this evening's strike were qualitatively and quantitatively different than 2017. Last year, we conducted a unilateral strike on a single site. The focus was on the aircraft associated with the Syrian chemical weapons attack in April of 2017. This evening, we conducted strikes with two allies on multiple sites that will result in a long-term degradation of Syrians' capability to research, develop, and employ chemical and biological weapons. Important infrastructure was destroyed, which will result in a setback for the Syrian regime. They will lose years of research and development data, specialized equipment, and expensive chemical weapons precursors. The strike was not only a strong message to the regime that their actions were inexcusable, but it also inflicted maximum damage without unnecessary risk to innocent civilians.
General Dunford earlier this evening with Defense Secretary Mattis at the Pentagon explaining the action that the U.S., the French, and the Brits undertook against Syria. ABC's Karen Travers, our White House correspondent, with a final thought. Karen, as this evening has unfolded the way President Trump almost predicted it would, with a strike limited in scope, and whether he is prepared to go further, we wait to see.
And the president certainly said tonight to Bashar al-Assad, if you do this again, the United States is prepared to continue this campaign to deter you from doing that. I think notably this was the week's big issue. We've been waiting for 5 days to see what President Trump was going to do. Late Friday night, he announces his decision and this strike on Syria. Aaron, there's another big crisis looming next week. He will be meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister. North Korea will likely be the big story next week. So from one big foreign policy hotspot, crisis point, to perhaps another one next week.
ABC's Karen Travers. Tonight, the United States, France, and Britain attacked Syria with missiles, aiming at targets associated with chemical weapons. Syrians woke on a Saturday morning to the sound of bombardment and the sight of smoke billowing over Damascus. The Pentagon said this was a one-time shot. The combat operation is over, though President Trump mentioned the possibility of additional action should Syria deploy chemical weapons again. I'm Aaron Katersky. You've been listening to live coverage from ABC News.